Before the word samurai ever existed, before armor gleamed in the sun and swords became sacred, Japan was a quieter place. Not peaceful, but quiet in the way mountains are quiet, heavy with presence, watching everything that moves beneath them. The islands were wrapped in forests so thick they swallowed villages whole, with mist drifting slowly across rice fields at dawn. Life was fragile, uncertain, and often short. People stayed close to their homes because danger lived just beyond the trees in those early centuries. Power did not belong to warriors. It belonged to the imperial court. In the capital, nobles dressed in layered silk robes and spent their days composing poetry about falling leaves, moonlight, and longing. Status was measured by lineage and elegance, not strength. The emperor stood at the center of it all, seen not as a fighter, but as a divine figure, a descendant of the sun goddess herself. He ruled in name, in ritual, in spirit, but not with a sword. Far from the capital, though, reality felt very different. Japan's land was difficult to control. Mountains divided regions, roads were unreliable, and messages traveled slowly. Imperial authority weakened the farther it stretched from the court. Bandits appeared where officials could not reach. Disputes over land turned violent. And when trouble came, poetry could not stop it. Local landowners began to rely on men who could fight. Men who knew how to ride horses across uneven terrain. Men who could draw a bow and loose an arrow with deadly accuracy while moving at full speed. These fighters protected fields, villages, and families. They weren't nobles. They weren't refined. They were practical, hardened, and loyal to those who fed them. They were called bushi, warriors like tea first. They served the court. They were hired muscle, nothing more. But over time, something changed. These warriors passed their skills to their sons. Fighting became a family tradition. Loyalty shifted away from the emperor and toward local leaders who actually commanded men and land. Power stopped flowing outward from the capital and began growing upward from the provinces. To be why the late Heian period, two great warrior clans had risen above all others. The Taira and the Minamoto both traced their ancestry to the imperial family, but neither was content to remain in the background. They guarded the court, enforced its will, and slowly tightened their grip around it. The court made a mistake then, a fatal one. It gave warriors authority and assumed it could take it back. That it couldn't. Tension finally snapped in 1180. What followed was the Genpei War, a brutal civil war that tore Japan apart. This was not elegant conflict. Village burned, rivers filled with bodies. Families were erased for the sake of clan loyalty. The Taira held the capital and controlled the emperor. The Minamoto were hunted, scattered, nearly destroyed. For a time, it seemed the Taira would win. But among the Minamoto was a man who understood something others did not. Minamoto no Yoritamo was not the strongest warrior, nor the most fearless on the battlefield. His strength was patience. He understood that the future of Japan would not be decided in palace halls, but by controlling warriors themselves. From his base in Kamakura, far from the capital's politics, Yoritamo gathered fighters from the provinces. Men who lived by the sword. Men who cared little for court rank and everything for loyalty. Slowly, steadily, he built a power base the court could not see coming in 1185. The war ended at sea. The Taira were annihilated, their banners sinking beneath the waves. Japan held its breath, expecting the old order to return. It didn't. Yoritamo did not take the imperial throne. He didn't need to. In 1192, he accepted a new title instead, one that changed the country forever. Shogun, great general, the emperor remained, untouched, divine, ceremonial. But real power now belonged to a warrior government, a shogunate ruled by men who fought, not wrote poetry. This was the moment the samurai truly emerged. not just as fighters, but as rulers. The age of the samurai had begun, and it would shape Japan for nearly 700 years. The new warrior government settled into Kamakura, far from the elegant streets of the old capital. It was a deliberate choice. Kamakura was surrounded by hills and the sea, easy to defend and hard to reach. This was not a place for poetry contests or silk robes. It was a place for discipline, orders, and iron. The men who gathered there were different from the court nobles of Kyoto. They wore practical clothing, carried weapons even in daily life, and spoke plainly. They were warriors ruling warriors. For the first time, Japan was governed by those who lived by the sword. Under the Kamakura shogunate, the role of the warrior began to change. No longer were they just hired muscle or local defenders. They were administrators, judges, and enforcers of law. Land was granted in exchange for service. Loyalty was no longer a vague concept. It was a contract sealed with blood and obligation. A warrior swore himself to a lord, and in return received protection, land, and status. Betrayal meant ruin, not just for the individual, but for his entire family. This system slowly shaped the identity of the samurai. Honor became practical before it became philosophical. A man's word mattered because survival depended on it. Cowardice endangered everyone. Courage, even in defeat, earned respect. Death in service was preferable to life in disgrace, because disgrace meant losing everything. Yet this new order was fragile. The Kamakura shogunate ruled in the name of the Minamoto, but after Yoritomo's death, his bloodline weakened. Real power slipped into the hands of regents from the Hojo clan, relatives by marriage who ruled from the shadows. The shogun became a figurehead, much like the emperor had been before. Once again, power hid behind titles. Then came a threat no warrior tradition had prepared for. In the 13th century, word reached Japan of a vast empire sweeping across Asia. The Mongols, led by Kublai Khan, had conquered China, Korea, and lands beyond imagining. Their armies were unlike anything the samurai had faced. They fought in massive formations, used gunpowder weapons, and cared little for individual duels or honor. To them, war was efficiency. When the Mongols demanded Japan's submission, the shogunate refused. In 1274, the first Mongol invasion arrived. Samurai rode to the beaches expecting familiar combat. Instead, they were met with exploding bombs, coordinated volleys of arrows, and soldiers who advanced without fear of death. The traditional warrior challenge, calling out one's name and lineage before combat, meant nothing to the invaders. Samurai fell, shocked not just by defeat, but by how foreign this kind of war felt. And then, the storm came, but a massive typhoon tore through the Mongol fleet, smashing ships against the coast and drowning thousands. The survivors fled. Japan was saved not by strategy or strength, but by nature itself. The warriors called it kamikaze, divine wind. When the Mongols returned 7 years later, stronger and more determined, the samurai were ready. Fortifications lined the shores. Fighters had adapted. And once again, a great storm destroyed the invading fleet. Japan survived. But victory came at a cost. There was no land to reward the warriors who fought. No conquered territory. No spoils of war. Samurai had risked everything and gained nothing but survival. Discontent spread. Loyalty weakened. The system that held the warrior class together began to crack. By the 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate collapsed under its own weight. Civil war returned, this time between rival emperors backed by competing warrior factions. Japan entered a long age of instability, where loyalty shifted, alliances broke, and power was seized by force. Out of this chaos, a new kind of samurai emerged, not just servants of a lord, but ambitious leaders themselves. Men who would rise through betrayal as often as loyalty. The battlefield became a ladder, and anyone strong or clever enough could climb it. The country fractured. Provinces became battlefields. Castles rose across the landscape like scars. This era became known as the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. For generations, Japan knew nothing but conflict. Samurai fought constantly, refining their skills, their armor, and their tactics. Sword became lighter and sharper. Discipline became stricter. Zen Buddhism spread among warriors, offering calm in the face of death. Meditation taught them to accept impermanence, to act without hesitation, to face the end without fear. This was the age that shaped the samurai legend. And from this chaos, 3 men would rise, one after another, each closer than the last to unifying all of Japan. Their names would echo through history. The first of those men was born a peasant, or at least close enough that the highborn never let him forget it. Toyotomi Hideyoshi began life with no great name, no noble lineage, no destiny written for him. He was small, clever, endlessly observant, and painfully aware of his place at the bottom of a violent world. In an age where birth determined worth, Hideyoshi learned early that survival depended on adaptability. He rose through the ranks not by strength, but by understanding people. He watched how commanders thought, how soldiers followed, how fear and reward shaped loyalty. Serving under the warlord Oda Nobunaga, he proved himself again and again, turning impossible situations into victories through speed, deception, and audacity. When Nobunaga was betrayed and killed by one of his own generals, the country expected chaos. Hideyoshi moved faster than anyone thought possible, but he crushed the traitor within days, gathered allies, and positioned himself as Nobunaga's successor. One by one, rival warlords fell or bent the knee. By the end of the 16th century, Hideyoshi stood at the center of Japan, a man of humble birth ruling a land soaked in blood. Yet Hideyoshi understood something critical. Endless war had to end, or the country would never truly belong to him. Samurai had become too powerful, too accustomed to violence. To control them, he reshaped their world. He separated warriors from farmers, freezing social classes in place. Samurai were ordered to live in castle towns, removed from the land they once farmed. Only they could carry swords. The blade was no longer just a weapon. It was a badge of identity. The sword hunt stripped peasants of arms, ensuring rebellion would be nearly impossible. In doing so, Hideyoshi turned the samurai from roaming warriors into a permanent ruling class. But he was not done. Obsessed with legacy and glory, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward. He dreamed of conquering Asia, of standing equal to the great emperors of history. In 1592, he invaded Korea, sending waves of samurai across the sea. The war was brutal, costly, and ultimately unwinnable. Samurai fought fiercely, but supply lines stretched thin, and Korean resistance, aided by China, bled the army dry. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, his dream died with him. The power vacuum he left behind was dangerous. Into that space stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, a patient, calculating warlord who had survived decades of shifting alliances. Where Hideyoshi was bold, Ieyasu was cautious. Where others rushed, he waited. He understood that the final battle would decide everything. That in 1600, armies gathered at Sekigahara. The battlefield was thick with fog. Tens of thousands of samurai faced each other, banners snapping in the wind. Loyalties were uncertain. Betrayal hovered over both sides. When the fighting began, it was chaos. Steel on steel, arrows darkening the sky, bodies falling in the mud. Then, as the battle turned, key commanders switched sides. By the end of the day, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. 3 years later, he became shogun. With that, the age of constant war ended. The Tokugawa shogunate ushered in more than 2 centuries of peace. Samurai, bred for battle, suddenly found themselves without wars to fight. Castles became administrative centers. Battles were replaced with bureaucracy. The sword remained at their side, but it was rarely drawn. This long piece transformed the samurai more than any battlefield ever had. Warriors became officials, teachers, and scholars. Confucian ideals reshaped their code, emphasizing loyalty, duty, and self-control. What would later be called Bushido, the way of the warrior, took form not in war, but in peace. Honor became internal, something to live by every day rather than prove in combat. Yet beneath the calm, tension grew. Samurai still lived on stipends paid in rice, fixed incomes that did not change with the economy. As commerce flourished, merchants grew wealthy, while warriors struggled with debt. The social order said samurai stood above merchants, but reality said otherwise. Pride and poverty became constant companions. Some clung desperately to old ideals. Others adapted. A few rebelled in quiet, desperate ways. The sword, once a tool of survival, became a symbol, heavy with meaning, but increasingly detached from daily life. And then, far beyond Japan's shores, the world began to change. For more than 200 years, Japan had sealed itself away from the world. Foreign ships were turned back. Christianity was outlawed. Trade was tightly controlled. The Tokugawa shogunate believed peace could only survive if outside influence was kept at a distance. And for a long time, it worked. The country remained stable, orderly, predictable. Samurai walked the streets with their swords at their sides, guardians of a peace they no longer had to fight for. But history does not stay still. In 1853, black ships appeared on the horizon. They were unlike anything Japan had ever seen. Tall, steam-powered vessels belching smoke, bristling with cannons. They sailed into Edo Bay under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy. His message was simple and terrifying. Japan would open its ports to the world, or be forced to. The shogunate had no answer. Centuries of isolation had left Japan militarily outdated. Samurai swords and bows meant nothing against modern artillery. The government signed treaties it did not fully understand, surrendering control of trade and territory. Unequal agreements humiliated the country and shattered confidence in the shogunate's ability to protect it. Anger spread. Many samurai believed the Tokugawa had failed their sacred duty. Some called for the emperor to be restored to power. Others demanded the expulsion of all foreigners. The old loyalty that once bound warrior to shogun began to unravel. Japan slipped into turmoil once more. Young samurai, raised on ideals of honor and sacrifice, found themselves in a world that no longer made sense. Some became assassins, striking down officials and foreigners in the name of restoring Japan's strength. Others studied Western weapons and tactics, realizing that survival now required change. The country split between tradition and transformation in 1868. The breaking point came. The Tokugawa shogunate fell, defeated by forces claiming to act in the emperor's name. This moment became known as the Meiji Restoration. Power returned to the emperor, not as a divine symbol, but as the head of a modernizing state. And for the samurai, everything ended. Their stipends were abolished. Their exclusive right to carry swords was revoked. Class distinctions that had defined society for centuries were dismantled. The warrior elite, once the rulers of Japan, were told to become ordinary citizens. Some adapted, becoming soldiers, police officers, businessmen, teachers. Others could not let go. Rebellions flared. The most famous came in 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, a former samurai who had helped bring down the shogunate. He believed the new Japan had lost its soul. Leading thousands of disaffected warriors, he rose against the modern army armed with rifles and artillery. The rebellion was crushed. Seigo died on the battlefield, sword in hand, facing gunfire. He would later be remembered as the last true samurai. With his death, the age of the samurai ended, or so it seemed. Because while the class disappeared, the spirit did not. The ideals forged over centuries, loyalty, discipline, endurance, honor did not vanish. They were reshaped. They flowed into the new Japanese army, into education, into business, into the national identity itself. The sword left the warrior's waist, but remained in the culture's memory. In modern Japan, the samurai live on not as rulers or fighters, but as stories. In films, novels, and quiet philosophies about how to face life with resolve. The samurai became a mirror, reflecting what people believed strength should look like. Not endless violence, but calm in the face of hardship. The history of the samurai is not just the story of warriors and battles. It is the story of change, of adaptation, of knowing when to fight and when to let go. A reminder that even the most powerful traditions must eventually yield to time. And yet, when a blade catches the light in a museum, or a name echoes from a distant battlefield, it is impossible not to feel it. The quiet presence, the mountain watching back. Even after the last battles faded and the last swords were locked away, the echo of the samurai did not disappear. It lingered in quieter places, in habits and values that slipped so seamlessly into daily life that most people no longer noticed where they came from. The warrior had vanished from the streets, but the mindset remained, folded into the way people worked, endured, and carried responsibility. In the new Japan, speed replaced tradition. Railways cut through old provinces. Factories rose where fields once stood. Western clothes replaced armor, and rifles replaced blades. To many former samurai, this world felt hollow, stripped of meaning. But others recognized something familiar beneath the surface. Discipline was still demanded. Loyalty still mattered. Endurance was still praised. The battlefield had simply changed. Where a samurai once served a lord, now a worker served company. Where a warrior once trained his body, now he trained his craft. Where honor once meant dying for one's master, it slowly transformed into living responsibly for family, community, and nation. The philosophy survived because it adapted. Bushido, once an unspoken code shaped by survival, became an idea written, taught, and romanticized. Writers and thinkers looked back on the samurai age not as it truly was, but as they wished it had been. Brutality softened into nobility. Political violence became moral clarity. The samurai transformed from flawed humans into symbols. And symbols are powerful. During times of hardship, Japan reached for that symbol. During war, the image of the samurai was revived to inspire sacrifice. During peace, it was used to promote discipline and perseverance. The warrior became less about killing and more about enduring hardship without complaint. Outside Japan, the samurai took on a life of their own. Stories traveled across oceans. Filmmakers framed them against sunsets and falling cherry blossoms. The world fell in love with the idea of the lone warrior, calm, precise, bound by honor in a chaotic world. A figure who moved slowly, spoke little, and accepted death without fear. It was never the full truth, but it was a beautiful one. And maybe that's why the samurai still matter. Because at their core, stripped of armor and myth, the samurai were people trying to live with purpose in an uncertain world. They faced change, loss, and inevitability just like everyone else. Some adapted, some resisted, some broke under the weight of it all. Their story is not about perfection, but it's about response. How do you act when the world shifts beneath your feet? How do you stay grounded when everything familiar disappears? How do you carry responsibility when no one is watching? These were samurai questions long before they became modern ones. Today, the castles stand quiet. The battlefields are fields again. Swords rest behind glass, admired but untouched. Yet the presence remains subtle but persistent, like footsteps fading down a long corridor. The samurai are no longer warriors of steel and blood. They are reminders that strength does not always roar, that discipline can be calm, that honor is often invisible, and that even when an age ends, its spirit can choose to walk forward quietly into whatever comes next. Just like the mountains, time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. When people look back at the samurai now, they often see clean lines and clear rules, a world where honor was simple and choices were certain. But the truth was always messy, eh? Samurai doubted. They failed. They made compromises. They lived long stretches of ordinary life between moments of violence and decision. Most of them never died in dramatic last stands. They worried about money, about family, about whether their loyalty would be repaid or forgotten. That, too, is part of the story, because the real legacy of the samurai is not the sword or the armor, or even the code that later generations try to define. It is the tension between ideals and reality, between who someone wanted to be and what the world demanded of them. Samurai lived inside that tension every day, balancing duty and survival, pride and obedience, fear and resolve. When the old order collapsed, it wasn't just a political change. It was an identity crisis. Imagine spending your entire life preparing for a role the world suddenly tells you no longer exists. Imagine being trained to die with honor, only to be asked to live quietly instead. That transition was harder than any battlefield. Some former samurai carried bitterness to their graves. Others found new purpose. A few discovered that the discipline they had cultivated could still guide them, even without a blade in hand. In that sense, the samurai never truly disappeared. They dissolved into the population, their mindset diluted but persistent. Even now, traces remain in unexpected places, in the patience of craftsmanship, in the quiet pride of doing a job well. Even when no one notices it, in the idea that how you act under pressure reveals who you truly are. These ideas don't belong to the past. They feel ancient because they are human, and that may be why the samurai continue to resonate centuries after their time has passed. Not because they were flawless heroes, but because they wrestled with the same questions people still ask today. What do I owe to others? What do I owe to myself? What is worth standing for when standing comes at a cost? The world no longer needs armored warriors riding into battle, but it still needs people who can face uncertainty with steadiness. People who understand that strength does not always announce itself. That restraint can be more powerful than aggression. That meaning is often found not in victory, but in conduct. The samurai story begins in blood and ends in memory. It rises from chaos, hardens into order, and fades into reflection. And maybe that's how all long human stories end. Not with a final clash, but with a quiet understanding. The sound of steel fades, the banners fall, the footsteps grow distant, but the path remains. When the noise finally fades, when the centuries of conflict, ambition, and discipline settle into silence, what remains is not a warrior standing tall on a battlefield, but a long road stretching behind him. A road marked by choices, compromises, and moments where history could have turned in a different direction. The story of the samurai, when allowed to breathe and unfold slowly, is less like a legend and more like a river, winding, changing shape, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, always moving forward. In their earliest days, the warriors who would later be called samurai did not think of themselves as symbols or ideals. They were men trying to survive in a land that demanded toughness. Their armor was heavy because death was close. Their loyalty was strong because isolation was dangerous. Over generations, necessity hardened into tradition, and tradition slowly transformed into identity. A way of living became a way of being. As the centuries passed, the sword grew heavier with meaning. At first, it was simply a tool. Then it became a marker of status. Eventually, it became a reflection of the soul. Samurai were taught to care for their blades as extensions of themselves, to keep them clean, sharp, and ready. In doing so, they were really being taught to maintain themselves with the same care. Rust on steel was neglect. Hesitation in battle was decay. Discipline was preservation. Training was relentless. From a young age, samurai learned to endure discomfort without complaint. Cold mornings, repetitive drills, long hours of stillness followed by sudden violence. These practices were not just about fighting. They were about control. Control of breath, control of emotion, control of fear. A samurai who lost control endangered everyone around him. And yet, despite all this structure, fear never vanished. Samurai were not fearless. They were trained to move through fear without being ruled by it. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. This distinction shaped the samurai mindset more than any weapon ever could. As warfare evolved, so did the role of the warrior. Battles became larger, tactics more complex. Individual duels gave way to coordinated formations. Firearms arrived, shattering the illusion that skill alone determined fate. Some samurai resisted these changes, clinging to the purity of swordsmanship. Others adapted quickly, recognizing that survival had always depended on flexibility, not nostalgia. Adaptation, however, came at a psychological cost. The more efficient warfare became, the less personal it felt. The distance between action and consequence widened. The quiet ritual of drawing a blade was replaced by the thunder of gunfire. Many warriors felt something slipping away, even as they continued to serve. Then peace arrived, unexpectedly long and suffocating. During the Tokugawa era, generations of samurai were born who would never know real war. They inherited armor they would never wear in battle, swords they would never draw in anger. For them, honor became something internalized rather than tested. Etiquette replaced combat. Reputation replaced survival. This created a strange contradiction. Samurai were expected to embody readiness for death in a world that no longer required it. They practiced for battles that would never come, rehearsed ideals that had nowhere to be proven. Some turned inward, studying philosophy, poetry, and calligraphy. Others grew restless, feeling trapped in a role that had lost its original purpose. Debt became common. Pride prevented many from admitting weakness. The warrior who once protected villages now struggled to support his own household. This quiet suffering rarely makes it into legends, but it defined daily life for countless samurai during the long peace. And still, they endured, because endurance had always been the core of the path. Not glory, not victory, endurance. When the modern world finally arrived with its machines, treaties, and relentless pace, it did not ask for permission. It did not pause to honor tradition. It simply moved forward. Samurai faced a final test, not of combat, but of identity. Could they exist without the structure that had defined them for centuries? Some answered yes. They carried their discipline into new professions. They taught, organized, led, and built. Others answered no, choosing resistance even when resistance meant certain defeat. Their rebellions were not about winning. They were about refusing to let the past vanish without acknowledgement. History remembers those moments because they were dramatic, but history often forgets the quieter transitions. The samurai who laid down his sword and became a clerk. The warrior who taught his son arithmetic instead of archery. The man who lived long enough to realize that survival itself could be an act of honor. In the end, the samurai were not erased. They were absorbed, their values scattered into the fabric of society, becoming harder to identify, but no less real. The emphasis on self-discipline, the respect for mastery, the belief that how you do something matters as much as what you do. These ideas traveled far beyond Japan, resonating with people who had never held a sword or worn armor. Because at their heart, They speak to something universal, the desire to live with intention, to face difficulty without collapsing, to carry responsibility with quiet strength. The samurai story does not conclude with a final battle or a closing date on a timeline. It dissolves gradually, like twilight replacing daylight. There is no single moment where the warrior disappears, only a long, gentle fading where the past becomes memory and memory becomes meaning. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending of all, because the samurai were never meant to last forever. They were shaped by their time, just as we were shaped by ours. What endures is not the armor, not the blade, not the banner, but the question they lived with every day, whether spoken or not. How will you walk your path, knowing it will one day end? The longer you sit with the story of the samurai, the more it stops feeling like history and starts feeling like a conversation that never really ended. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, but a quiet presence that waits until the noise dies down. The samurai way was never meant to shout. It was meant to endure, to stay upright when everything else was moving, to hold shape in a world that constantly demanded change. For most samurai, life was not a sequence of heroic moments. It was routine. It was repetition. It was waking before dawn, maintaining equipment that might never be used, practicing forms until the movements became unconscious. The body learned before the mind did. Over time, the sword arm moved without thought. The feet found balance without instruction. The breath settled automatically in moments of tension. This was not about becoming dangerous. It was about becoming steady. Steadiness was survival. A samurai who acted impulsively endangered his lord. A samurai who lost control endangered his family. A samurai who chased glory endangered the order that fed him. So restraint became as important as strength. Silence as important as speech. Waiting as important as action. This mindset shaped everything, from how a warrior walked into a room to how he accepted an insult without reaching for his blade. And insults mattered. Reputation mattered. In a tightly bound social order, perception could be as lethal as steel. A careless word could start a feud that lasted generations. A moment of public shame could follow a family forever. That pressure carved deep lines into the samurai's psyche. They learned to read rooms, to sense shifts in tone, to anticipate conflict before it surfaced. Awareness became a form of armor. At the same time, death was never far away. Samurai lived with an intimacy toward death that feels foreign to the modern world. They were taught to contemplate it daily, not morbidly, but practically. If death was always present, it lost its power to paralyze. This practice was meant to free the warrior to act clearly, without hesitation. When you accept the end, the present sharpens. But acceptance did not mean indifference. Samurai loved deeply. They formed bonds with comrades, families, and teachers. They wrote letters before battles, poems before departures, quiet words meant to survive them if they did not return. These were not cold men chasing oblivion. They were human beings trying to reconcile attachment with inevitability. That contradiction lived at the heart of the samurai path that SP stretched on during the Tokugawa era. That contradiction became harder to carry. Samurai were expected to live as if war could return at any moment, while knowing it probably never would. Generations trained for a test that never came. The blade remained sharp, but the purpose dulled. Some found meaning in study, refining themselves intellectually the way their ancestors refined their swordsmanship. Others grew frustrated, feeling like ghosts haunting a world that no longer needed them. This is where romanticized history often falters. The samurai were not always noble philosophers strolling through cherry blossoms. Many were anxious, indebted, uncertain men trying to uphold ideals that no longer aligned with reality. Pride kept them from adapting quickly. Tradition anchored them when flexibility was needed. The same discipline that once made them formidable now made them rigid. And yet, even in decline, there was dignity, because decline does not erase effort. It does not invalidate a life lived with intention. The samurai who struggled in peace still carried centuries of inherited discipline in his posture, his speech, his sense of responsibility. Even when the world stopped rewarding those traits, he continued to practice them because they had become part of who he was. When the modern state dismantled the samurai class, it did not do so gently. It was abrupt, pragmatic, and unapologetic. The future demanded efficiency, not ceremony. Firearms did not care about lineage. Industry did not care about honor. Progress moved forward with or without consent. For many former samurai, this felt like betrayal by history itself. Yet time revealed something unexpected. The traits that defined the samurai did not vanish under modernity. They migrated. They showed up in new uniforms, new systems, new expectations. The military adopted discipline. Schools adopted structure. Companies adopted loyalty and hierarchy. The battlefield became an office, a factory, a classroom. The weapon changed. The pressure remained. This is why the samurai still resonate. Not because they were perfect, but because they faced the same underlying tension humans always face. How to live meaningfully inside systems we did not choose. How to maintain self-respect when circumstances shift beyond our control. How to move forward without abandoning ourselves in this sense. The samurai are less a historical class and more a case study in adaptation. They rose because they solved a problem. They ruled because they organized violence effectively. They declined because the problem changed. Their greatest strength and greatest weakness was the same thing: their commitment to a way of life. And maybe that is the quiet lesson buried beneath centuries of armor and myth. That commitment gives life depth, but it also demands awareness. That tradition can guide, but it can also blind. That honor, when rigid, can break under pressure, but when flexible, can transform. The samurai did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the world moved on. And the ones who survived, truly survived, were not those who clung hardest to the sword, but those who understood that the path was never about the sword at all. It was about how you carry yourself when no one is watching, how you treat power when you have it, how you respond when you lose it. These questions remain unanswered, waiting for each generation to respond in its own way. The story keeps going, not forward in time, but inward. When you let the story keep unfolding without rushing toward an ending, something interesting happens. The samurai stop feeling like figures locked in the past and start feeling like travelers you're walking beside for a while. Their world becomes less about armor and battles and more about rhythm. The rhythm of discipline repeated every day. The rhythm of obedience and doubt. The rhythm of learning when to act and when to endure. That the samurai's life was shaped by repetition long before it was shaped by crisis. Days often passed without drama. Training at dawn, administrative duties, patrols, study, meals taken in silence or polite conversation. These routines were not filler between battles. They were the foundation. When violence did come, it drew its meaning from the thousands of quiet hours that preceded it. This is something modern stories rarely show. They skip the waiting. They skip the boredom. They skip the slow accumulation of patience. But the samurai understood something deeply human. Character is not revealed in moments of intensity alone. It is built in the unremarkable hours when no one is watching and nothing exciting is happening. That is where discipline either takes root or fades. Young samurai were taught early that mastery was endless. No matter how skilled you became, there was always another layer beneath it, another refinement, another flaw to uncover. Arrogance was considered dangerous, not just morally, but practically. Overconfidence killed. Humility kept you alive. This humility wasn't weakness. It was awareness. awareness of how quickly circumstances could turn, how fragile even the strongest body truly was. Pain was accepted as a teacher, not glorified, but not avoided. Bruises, fatigue, and failure were all treated as information. They showed you where you were careless, where your balance was off, where your mind wandered. Instead of resenting pain, many samurai learned to observe it, to understand what it was pointing toward. This mindset bled into every aspect of life. When a samurai spoke, he chose his words carefully, not because he was afraid to speak, but because he understood the weight words carried. When he promised something, he did so knowing that reputation was not an abstract idea. It was currency. Once lost, it was nearly impossible to recover. Honor, in this sense, was not lofty or poetic. It was practical. It kept relationships functional in a world without safety nets. Yet this same emphasis on reputation could become a cage. Fear of shame sometimes prevented growth. Fear of appearing weak kept men silent when they needed help. The same code that demanded accountability also punished vulnerability. Samurai culture produced incredible resilience, but it often did so at the cost of emotional isolation. Many carried their struggles privately, believing that endurance meant silence. This, too, is part of the legacy. As centuries passed, the meaning of honor shifted subtly. In times of war, honor was proven through action. In times of peace, it was proven through restraint. A warrior who never drew his sword but maintained order without bloodshed was considered superior to one who rushed to violence. The ideal samurai became not the fiercest fighter, but the calmest presence. Still, the sword never lost its symbolic gravity. Even when firearms made it obsolete on the battlefield, the sword remained central to the samurai identity. It represented continuity, a physical link to ancestors who had walked the same path. To surrender the sword felt like surrendering memory itself. This is why the decree banning sword carrying struck so deeply. It wasn't just a policy change. It was an erasure of visible identity. Imagine being told that the object that defined you, that announced who you were to the world, was no longer allowed to exist at your side, that you were expected to blend in, to become indistinguishable. For many samurai, this was harder to accept than death, and yet, blending in is exactly what eventually happened. The transition was not immediate. It was uneven, painful, and full of resistance. But time, relentless as always, did its work. Children grew up without ever wearing swords. Stories replaced experience. Memory replaced muscle. The samurai moved from lived reality into narrative, and narratives have a strange power. Once something becomes a story, it can be shaped, polished, simplified. The contradictions soften, the failures fade. What remains is an image clean enough to admire. This is how the samurai became timeless icons, both inside and outside Japan. Not because their lives were simple, but because complexity is harder to carry across generations. Yet beneath every polished legend, the real texture remains, waiting for those willing to look closer. The samurai were never saints. They were not always just. They were capable of cruelty, ambition, and blind obedience. They enforced hierarchies that caused suffering. They upheld systems that favored some lives over others. Acknowledging this does not diminish their story. It completes it, because the most meaningful histories are not about perfection. They are about responsibility. The samurai lived inside systems larger than themselves. Some upheld those systems without question. Some tried to bend them. A few tried to break them. Most simply did their best within the limits they were given. That, more than any myth, is what makes them relatable. And this is where their story quietly turns back toward us that we no longer live in feudal Japan. We do not swear oaths to lords or carry swords in public, but we still navigate hierarchies. We still balance duty and desire. We still face moments where acting with integrity costs us something tangible. We still feel the pressure to perform roles that no longer fit the world we inhabit. The samurai faced these pressures without the language we have today. They responded with discipline because discipline was the tool available to them. It gave structure to chaos, meaning to suffering, direction to uncertainty. That is why their legacy endures not as a commandment, but as a question. What gives your life structure? What do you hold yourself to when no one enforces it? What part of your identity remains when the world changes its rules? The samurai do not answer these questions for us. They simply show us one way humans once tried to live with them. Slowly, deliberately, with awareness of impermanence. The road they walked has ended, but the ground beneath it is still solid. Anyone can step onto it, not by wearing armor or carrying a blade, but by choosing intention over impulse, responsibility over convenience, calm over reaction. And perhaps that is the quietest truth of all. The samurai were never meant to be copied. They were meant to be understood. The deeper you look into the life of a samurai, the more you realize that their story is not a straight line from rise to fall. It is a tapestry woven from countless small choices, repeated habits, and quiet moments that rarely make it into chronicles. Most people remember battles, betrayals, and heroic last stands, but the majority of a samurai's life was spent in the ordinary spaces between, preparing, observing, training, and reflecting. Endurance was their battlefield, and patience was their weapon. Consider a samurai walking along a narrow path through misty mountains. The air is damp, the stones slick underfoot. He carries no immediate threat, no urgent mission. Yet every step is careful, every movement intentional. His mind is alert, not because danger is present, but because danger is always possible. This constant awareness, this discipline of presence, is the core of what it meant to be a warrior. It shaped behavior, not just in combat, but in speech, in relationships, in thought. Even in times of prolonged peace during the Tokugawa era, samurai maintained this inner vigilance. Their world had changed. The battlefield had moved away from open plains and castles, but their minds remained trained for crisis. A sword might never be drawn, but the muscles, the reflexes, the instincts, and the mindset had to be ready at any moment. This created a life of quiet intensity, one that demanded attention to detail in all things. The alignment of armor, the cleanliness of a blade, the tone of a word, the subtle gestures in conversation. Every act became a form of practice. Every moment carried the potential to refine the self, and with refinement came contradiction. Samurai were expected to embody mercy and ruthlessness, loyalty and discretion, courage and restraint. The same man who would execute an enemy without hesitation might later bow deeply to his lord in submission, or compose a poem reflecting on the impermanence of life, the duality of existence, the ability to act decisively while remaining morally aware, was cultivated over years, sometimes decades, and it was never simple. These were humans contending with the weight of ideals far larger than themselves. The arrival of the modern era shattered that equilibrium. Western ships, firearms, and bureaucracies arrived like a storm that could not be fought with skill alone. Samurai swords, once extensions of self, were rendered ceremonial. The hierarchical structures that defined social life were dismantled. The age-old system that had given purpose and direction vanished almost overnight. For a class whose entire identity had been constructed around service, discipline, and readiness, this was more than political change. It was existential. Some samurai adapted, taking roles in the new army, government, or commerce. They transferred their discipline to new forms, and the essence of the samurai survived in these transformed contexts. Others resisted, clinging to the old ways, sometimes with fatal consequences. Rebellions flared. most famously the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Seigo Takamori, who became a symbol of the samurai's struggle to reconcile honor with an irreversible change. Seigo's final stand, sword in hand against an army armed with modern rifles and artillery, was the last violent echo of a class whose spirit had long been forged in fire and blood. Yet, even in defeat, the samurai left behind a legacy that outlived their swords. The principles that governed their lives, loyalty, endurance, attention to detail, courage, humility, did not vanish. They seeped into culture, philosophy, education, and social expectations. Modern Japan, in many ways, inherited the mindset of the samurai: precision, responsibility, perseverance, and respect for order. Even in times of peace, the echo of the warrior persists, not as a visible class, but as a subtle influence on behavior and values. The samurai's story, therefore, is less a tale of conquest and more a meditation on adaptability, identity, and resilience. They show us that living a life of intention often requires discipline that goes unseen, that survival may depend less on strength and more on awareness, patience, and moral clarity. They remind us that identity is both constructed and inherited, and that it can endure even when its original context disappears. They teach that honor is not always proven in action. Sometimes it is proven quietly, in the way one lives, chooses, and responds to change. And so, the samurai are not just historical figures. They are an enduring reflection of the human condition. The tension between duty and desire, between rigidity and adaptability, between courage and caution. These are struggles that exist in every era. The swords are gone, the castles stand empty, the banners have fallen, but the path they walked still resonates. Quietly, steadily, it invites us to consider how we face our own lives, our own challenges, and our own fleeting moments of significance. The story of the samurai is not just about what happened in the past. It is about how we carry the lessons forward, how discipline, awareness, and purpose can survive even when the world has changed beyond recognition. It is about understanding that the essence of the warrior is not in the clash of steel, but in the measured, deliberate, resilient way one meets life itself. Even in quiet moments, the life of a samurai was never truly idle. Consider the mornings in a castle town. Mist hung low over the rooftops. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke lingered in the air. Samurai rose before dawn, not out of habit alone, but because discipline demanded it. Meals were simple, often eaten in silence, every motion measured. There was always something to practice, a kata, a form, a mental exercise. Every hour spent moving deliberately, speaking thoughtfully, and observing the world sharpened them, even when no battle loomed. Life itself became a battlefield of attention, and then there were the relationships. Loyalty, in samurai terms, was a currency more valuable than gold. A warrior's honor depended not just on how he fought, but on how faithfully he served his lord, protected his family, and maintained the bonds with comrades. Trust could take years to build and be destroyed in a moment. Words, gestures, and small acts carried enormous weight. A misstep could haunt generations. And yet, for all the pressure, there was also beauty in the connection. Samurai formed bonds that were rare in their intensity. Friendships tempered like steel, unbreakable in ways few outside their world could understand. Death, of course, was always present. But the samurai did not approach it with panic. They approached it with intimacy. They contemplated it as part of daily reflection, understanding that any moment could be their last. By meditating on mortality, they freed themselves from fear. By accepting the impermanence of life, they could act decisively, move swiftly, and remain calm when others faltered. This was a paradox central to their existence. They trained to live in order to die with dignity, and in dying, they gave meaning to the discipline of living. The transition from warrior to bureaucrat during the long peace of the Tokugawa era was a test of character just as severe as any battle. Generations of samurai were born into calm, yet their minds remained trained for conflict. Castles became offices, swords became ceremonial, but the expectation of readiness persisted. The ability to remain steady, to act with precision, to measure every word and every motion continued to define them. Some flourished in this new world, translating their discipline into administration, education, or commerce. Others chafed against the monotony, haunted by the echo of past battles and the weight of expectations they could no longer fulfill. Even as modernization swept through Japan, the shadow of the samurai lingered. Schools taught discipline rooted in centuries-old traditions. Military academies instilled courage and obedience. Business practices demanded loyalty and attention to detail. The invisible hand of samurai ethos shaped lives long after swords had been sheathed. The essence of the warrior, perseverance, self-control, resilience, was woven into the fabric of the nation itself. Sometimes unnoticed, sometimes revered, sometimes misunderstood. Yet for all their adaptation, there was always tension. Samurai ideals emphasized moral clarity, but the world rarely offered it. They were taught to balance loyalty and honor, courage and restraint, yet life continually forced them to choose between imperfect options. Some choices led to glory, others to regret. Some men clung to the old ways with stubborn pride. Others reinvented themselves in a rapidly changing society. And many simply endured, carrying the weight of their heritage quietly, step by step, day by day. Even in exile from power, the samurai mind remained vigilant. Awareness of danger, caution in action, and reflection in thought continued to govern behavior. They knew that life demanded attention, that small mistakes could have large consequences, and that preparation was not merely for battle, but for living. They understood that the sword could be absent, but the discipline it symbolized could never be abandoned. The samurai legacy, therefore, is not captured in a single dramatic moment. It is woven through countless ordinary acts. Rising before dawn, observing the world closely, speaking carefully, maintaining composure, honoring obligations, embracing mortality, and enduring hardship. It is visible not in victories alone, but in persistence, not in fleeting glory, but in steady resolve. The story continues in the spaces between action and reflection, in the quiet footsteps through misty streets, in a measured breath before decision, in the awareness that life itself is a battlefield requiring constant vigilance. The life of a samurai was a study in contradictions. They were warriors trained to kill, yet much of their time was spent in silence. They were bound by rigid codes of loyalty and honor, yet their reality was often unpredictable, chaotic, and cruel. They were expected to act decisively, yet they spent countless hours practicing patience, learning to wait, to watch, to consider every movement before committing to it. The lessons of their daily lives were subtle but constant, like water carving a stone over centuries, shaping character more than bodies, resilience more than strength. Even when the clamor of battle fell silent, even when peace stretched across decades, their minds never stopped moving, analyzing, preparing, balancing risk with duty, and measuring every word, every gesture, every glance. Imagine a samurai in his quarters, early morning, before the world awakens. The light seeps through paper screens in soft lines across the tatami. His armor rests on polished stands, and used today, but maintained meticulously. The katana lies within reach, gleaming faintly in the dim light, not for battle, but as a symbol, a reminder, an anchor to centuries of heritage. He sits cross-legged, perhaps writing a letter to his lord, or a poem to express what cannot be spoken aloud. Each stroke of the brush is deliberate, meditative. Each moment carries weight, because every act is a rehearsal for a life where consequence is never far away. Even in peace, the samurai remains aware that order is fragile and that discipline is not just personal. It is the foundation of society itself. This awareness extended beyond personal conduct. Samurai were stewards of a broader social order. They enforced justice, maintained infrastructure, mediated disputes, and often carried the burden of leadership in local regions. A single misjudgment could lead to loss of property, honor, or even life for themselves or those under their protection. The sword was a last resort, but the mind was always active, calculating, anticipating, balancing ideals with survival. Their education was both physical and philosophical, encompassing martial skill, literature, etiquette, and the study of human behavior. A samurai who neglected any of these facets was considered incomplete, unprepared for the unpredictable turns of life. During the Tokugawa era, as peace extended for generations, the samurai faced a unique challenge. They had trained for centuries to live with imminent danger, yet their swords were rarely drawn. Their daily lives became a test of discipline in subtler ways. They had to maintain the mental rigor of combat without the external stimulus. They had to embody courage, honor, and decisiveness in a world that rewarded neither. Some found solace in poetry, calligraphy, and study. Others struggled, restless in the absence of the battlefield, longing for the clarity that conflict once provided. Many turned to internal reflection, cultivating an understanding of impermanence and mortality through meditation, philosophy, and the study of Zen. The practice of Zen, in particular, suited the samurai perfectly. It offered a path to maintain focus, clarity, and presence, regardless of circumstance. The principles of mindfulness, acceptance, and detachment allowed the warrior to remain centered even when the world shifted. This was essential because the samurai understood that life's greatest challenges were not always fought with steel. Battles of loyalty, integrity, and patience could last decades. Misjudging a subordinate, offending a superior, or failing to anticipate political shifts could have consequences as deadly as a sword blow. Through Zen, they trained not just for combat, but for life itself, learning to move with calm decisiveness, to act without hesitation, and to observe without attachment. The arrival of modernity tested these lessons in profound ways. The forced opening of Japan to the West in the 19th century brought unprecedented technological, political, and social change. Samurai swords and traditional tactics were rendered almost meaningless against firearms, steamships, and bureaucratic authority. For a class whose identity had been defined by combat, discipline, and hierarchical loyalty, this was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. Many samurai responded with resistance, some violently, most famously in the Satsuma Rebellion. Others chose adaptation, channeling their skills into new professions, helping to build the modern army, serve in government, or thrive in emerging industries. In adapting, the samurai retained the essence of their training. Discipline, strategic thinking, attention to detail, loyalty, and moral clarity did not vanish because the social context changed. These principles were portable, intangible, yet enduring. They influenced the new Japan in ways that often went unrecognized. Schools, military institutions, corporate structures, and civic organization all bore traces of the samurai ethos, subtly shaping a society that revered order, perseverance, and measured action at the same time. The psychological and emotional weight of adaptation was immense. Samurai were asked to lay down their swords, relinquish privileges, and redefine themselves in a society that no longer recognized their traditional role. Many struggled with loss of identity. Pride, once tied to duty and skill, now became a source of frustration. Some sank into debt or despair, unable to reconcile their place in the new order. Others transformed, finding purpose in mentoring, administration, or cultural preservation. The process was uneven, painful, and deeply human, illustrating that the challenges of honor and identity extend far beyond the battlefield. Even today, the shadow of the samurai endures. Their influence permeates Japanese culture, not in the form of swords or armor, but in mindset, behavior, and collective memory. Attention to detail, respect for hierarchy, awareness of consequence, and commitment to duty are hallmarks of modern Japanese society. Films, literature, and art romanticize the samurai, often emphasizing the heroic and noble aspects. But the real lesson lies in the subtle, everyday application of discipline, moral focus, and endurance. The samurai legacy is less about spectacle and more about cultivation of the self, a continuous engagement with the challenges of existence, and the cultivation of presence and purpose. Even as centuries pass, one can imagine the quiet persistence of that ethos. A man rising before dawn, practicing a form with measured attention, a letter composed thoughtfully, each word weighed, a movement executed with balance and precision, a decision made not in haste, but after careful observation of human behavior. The samurai's world, though transformed, remains a testament to the power of deliberate living, the strength found in self-mastery, and the quiet endurance of principles forged over generations. Even as the samurai receded from the battlefield, even as the clang of steel and the cries of war faded into memory, their presence never fully disappeared. The life of a samurai was not defined solely by combat. It was a continuous engagement with order, with discipline, with self-awareness. Long before modern psychology or philosophy framed the human mind as a field of constant observation, the samurai had mastered it. Every gesture, every movement, every choice was a negotiation with reality itself, a small exercise in understanding impermanence, consequence, and intention. Life was the ultimate dojo, and each day a test in balance, focus, and moral clarity. Picture a samurai walking through a quiet village at dawn, the sun barely touching the rooftops. His steps are deliberate, unhurried, yet every muscle is alert. The children stir. The merchants begin setting up their stalls. The scent of wood smoke and fresh rice drifts through the air. The samurai's sword is sheathed, his armor set aside, yet he carries the weight of centuries in his posture. Every aspect of his being, the stance, the gaze, the cadence of movement, is informed by generations of training, by the silent inheritance of responsibility, loyalty, and vigilance. He is both ordinary and extraordinary, a man living quietly while embodying the lessons of a class that once ruled a nation. Discipline was not mere routine, it was a philosophy. Repetition, meditation, and attention to minutiae trained the samurai mind to perceive patterns, anticipate danger, and remain composed in chaos. A falling leaf, a shifting shadow, the subtle tensing of a comrade's hand. Nothing escaped notice. These habits of acute observation extended into social life as well. In interactions with others, a samurai spoke deliberately, measured gestures, weighed his words, and interpreted the intentions of those around him with the same precision he had once reserved for battle. The practice of mindfulness, centuries before the term existed, became second nature, and with it came an understanding of subtle power, influence that is exerted not through force, but through calm, presence, and perception. Yet the samurai were never untouchable. Their discipline, their honor, their poise, these were tested continuously, often in ways invisible to outsiders. Political intrigue, shifting alliances, financial pressures, family responsibilities, and the unpredictable nature of human emotion demanded constant negotiation. A misstep could tarnish reputation, bring shame, or unravel carefully cultivated networks of trust. The stakes were not always life and death in the immediate sense, but over time, they carried consequences just as real. For a samurai, every choice was moral, practical, and philosophical all at once. Every action, even the smallest, became a reflection of self and a rehearsal for potential crisis. When modernization arrived, it challenged the very essence of what it meant to be a samurai. Steamships, rifles, bureaucracies, and foreign powers rendered traditional combat largely obsolete. The social structures that had elevated the warrior class were dismantled. Samurai were no longer guaranteed status, privilege, or livelihood. To survive, some adapted, channeling their training into new roles. Military officers, teachers, government administrators, industrial leaders. Others resisted, clinging to old ways, participating in rebellions, or fading into obscurity. This transitional period was one of profound dislocation, a cultural earthquake that tested identity more severely than any battlefield had ever done. What is remarkable, however, is how enduring the samurai ethos proved to be. Though stripped of legal authority and the right to bear arms, the principles cultivated over centuries, discipline, awareness, loyalty, courage, self-restraint, remained embedded in behavior, thought, and social expectation. They migrated into the modern state, into corporate life, into education, into literature and art. The tools changed, the context changed, but the mindset survived. The capacity for calm in chaos, for deliberation under pressure, for ethical action even when inconvenient. All of these traits, honed through centuries of survival and refinement, continued to influence Japanese society long after the swords had been sheathed. Consider the psychological architecture of the samurai mind. It was built on repetition and ritual, yes, but also on reflection, on constant evaluation of action and consequence. Daily meditation, study of texts, and martial practice trained a warrior to act decisively while remaining aware of the impermanence of life. This duality, preparedness for violence combined with philosophical contemplation, was the core of samurai identity. It demanded constant self-observation, the willingness to confront failure and weakness, and the courage to act in accordance with principle, even when the world rewarded compromise in peace. These lessons became internalized. Samurai no longer tested themselves through battle, but through life itself. They applied the same principles to governance, administration, education, and family. A samurai who managed his household effectively, who raised children with discipline and care, who maintained integrity in the face of corruption or personal inconvenience, was practicing the same skills he would have used on the battlefield. Action became metaphorical, and morality became the arena of mastery. In this sense, the samurai transformed from warriors into architects of social and ethical order. Even outside Japan, the mythos of the samurai endured because these qualities resonate universally. The image of the calm, disciplined, morally anchored individual confronting chaos appeals across cultures because it reflects a deeply human aspiration to act with purpose, clarity, and courage amid uncertainty. Films, novels, and popular culture have romanticized the samurai, sometimes stripping away the nuance and hardship of daily life. But the core remains compelling because it is fundamentally about human character, resilience, and the cultivation of focus, integrity, and self-mastery. And yet, the samurai were not flawless. They were capable of cruelty, ambition, and error. They enforced hierarchies that caused suffering. They operated within systems that rewarded power over morality. Acknowledging this does not diminish their story, it enriches it. It reveals that their endurance, discipline, and courage were exercised not in a vacuum of virtue, but in a messy, human world. The same qualities that could inspire greatness could also entrench injustice. The duality of their lives, noble ideals constrained by human imperfection, is part of what makes their history enduringly instructive. Ultimately, the samurai story is not just a historical chronicle. It is a meditation on human capacity for adaptation, integrity, and resilience. It is about maintaining purpose when circumstances shift, about cultivating self-mastery even when the world offers no immediate reward, and about facing mortality and uncertainty with awareness. Their swords may no longer clash, their banners may have fallen, their castles may stand silent, yet the principles they embodied continue to ripple through time. They offer a mirror, a chance to reflect on how we live, how we act, and how we carry ourselves when life becomes difficult, uncertain, or unpredictable. The essence of the samurai endures in the quiet moments, in small acts of discipline, in the careful consideration of action, in the persistent pursuit of moral clarity. It lives in the way we meet challenges, the way we honor responsibility, the way we practice patience and attention. The spirit of the warrior has shifted from battlefield to mind, from steel to habit, from outward conquest to inward cultivation. And in this transformation, the samurai story becomes less about swords and battles and more about life itself. The continuous, deliberate engagement with existence that tests character, shapes identity, and demands endurance in the face of inevitable change. The world of the samurai was never simply black and white. It was a spectrum of obligation, morality, ambition, and survival. Their lives were defined not only by the moments of extraordinary action, but by the long stretches of observation, patience, and preparation that preceded them. For every battle remembered in history, there were countless hours of quiet study, repetition, and reflection, moments that shaped character more profoundly than any clash of swords ever could. Samurai understood, perhaps better than most, that the measure of a person was not found in the fireworks of heroism, but in the persistence of integrity over years, decades, and generations. Imagine a young warrior, barely more than a boy, walking through a garden at dawn. The dew clings to the moss-covered stones. A soft wind rattles the branches of pine trees. His sword rests at his side, polished and balanced. He practices forms over and over, observing how his body moves, how his balance shifts, how his breath carries strength and calm simultaneously. Each motion is a rehearsal for both action and thought. Each repetition is a meditation on presence. Every day, he learns not only how to wield a blade, but how to maintain himself in the face of uncertainty. Even at such a young age, he begins to understand that the battlefield is not always physical. It is mental, emotional, and moral. The importance of observation cannot be overstated. Samurai eyes learn to see what others overlooked. The subtle tension in a man's shoulder, the hesitation in a subordinate's voice, the shift of light across a courtyard that signals danger or opportunity. Their minds cataloged information constantly, analyzing patterns, predicting outcomes, and anticipating consequences. This heightened awareness was a form of survival training, yes, but it was also an ethical exercise. Knowing what is happening, what might happen, and how your actions ripple through the lives of others. This is responsibility in its purest form. Samurai bore it always, and yet awareness came with weight. The discipline that allowed samurai to act decisively in battle also demanded control in all aspects of life. Silence was a tool. Patience was a weapon. Reflection was armor. The same man who could cut down an enemy without hesitation also needed to bow with perfect form, write a measured letter, or deliver counsel without arrogance. Life was a constant negotiation between extremes: action and restraint, pride and humility, violence and compassion. The ability to navigate these tensions defined the quality of a samurai, often more than any victory on a battlefield. Peace brought a new kind of challenge. When Tokugawa rule solidified the country, prolonged stability forced warriors to redirect their discipline inward. For generations, they trained for war they would never fight. Their swords became ceremonial, their battles metaphorical, and their courage measured in restraint rather than in killing. Some flourished in this environment, becoming scholars, teachers, and administrators. Others struggled, restless in the absence of conflict, nostalgic for the clarity and decisiveness that only combat provided. They found themselves confronting a new battlefield, the landscape of identity itself. This tension reached its peak with the opening of Japan to the modern world. Western powers arrived with technologies, ideologies, and bureaucratic systems that made centuries of samurai training suddenly seem inadequate. Rifles replaced bows, steamships replaced cavalry, and written treaties replaced the fluid authority of a warlord. The social order that had defined the samurai's life, status, honor, loyalty, and responsibility, was dismantled almost overnight. To survive, some embraced the new era, finding roles in the military, government, or industry. Others rebelled, clinging to tradition in acts of desperation. The Satsuma Rebellion stands as the final dramatic echo of this conflict, a battle between identity and modernity, where steel met gunpowder and centuries of ethos met relentless change. Yet even in defeat, the principles of the samurai persisted. The values forged over generations, discipline, loyalty, moral clarity, resilience, patience, awareness, were not confined to the battlefield. They traveled into the fabric of the new Japan, influencing governance, education, commerce, and even daily behavior. The essence of the samurai proved remarkably portable. While swords were no longer drawn, the mind remained sharp. The training endured, not in the obvious demonstration of power, but in subtle mastery of self, in persistence under adversity, in the cultivation of character against invisible pressures. Consider the deeper philosophy that underpinned this transformation. The samurai understood impermanence in a way that few in the modern world truly grasp. Life, fortune, favor, and power were all temporary. Death was inevitable. Circumstances were always shifting. By embracing these truths, they cultivated detachment without apathy, courage without recklessness, and honor without vanity. This understanding allowed them to navigate not only violent conflict, but political intrigue, social complexity, and personal hardship. It taught them to act with purpose even when outcomes were uncertain, to uphold principle when convenience offered a softer path, and to carry themselves with dignity even in the absence of recognition. This philosophy, distilled over centuries of practice and observation, is the most enduring legacy of the samurai. It transcends time, technology, and circumstance. It reminds us that strength is not only physical, that courage is not only found in dramatic moments, and that honor is not a reward, but a continuous choice. The principles the samurai cultivated are not relics. They are frameworks for living in any age. They teach the importance of awareness, of disciplined action, of moral engagement, and of calm presence amid chaos. They show that mastery is a lifelong pursuit, that character is forged not in moments of fame, but in the quiet repetition of deliberate choices, and that the measure of a person is found in how they respond when the world tests them, silently or otherwise. Even today, the influence of the samurai is visible, subtle, and pervasive. The attention to craft, the meticulous preparation, the calm focus under pressure, the respect for hierarchy and responsibility. These traits echo in Japanese business, education, art, and social interaction. Beyond Japan, the figure of the disciplined Principled Warrior continues to captivate imaginations around the world. Stories, films, and literature romanticize the samurai, often simplifying or exaggerating. Yet the essence remains compelling because it reflects something universally human: the struggle to act with integrity, awareness, and resilience in a world that is unpredictable and often unforgiving. The samurai, in this sense, were not merely a historical class. They were architects of a way of being. Their swords, banners, and castles may have fallen silent, but their ethos endured, traveling through time and habits, values, and cultural memory. They embodied the principle that life itself is a battlefield, less of steel than of attention, less of blood than of character, less of conquest than of deliberate living. Their story, though rooted in a distant time, continues to speak to the challenges we face: how to live with purpose, how to meet difficulty without losing oneself, how to maintain integrity when the rules of the world change beneath our feet. And in contemplating the samurai, we begin to see something profound: that the truest battles are not fought on open fields with weapons, but within the human mind and spirit. That the greatest victories are not always visible. That endurance, patience, discipline, and moral clarity can be as powerful as any sword. That legacy is not measured in conquest, but in the quiet, continuous effort to live according to principle. The samurai's life, when you strip away the armor, the battles, and the ceremonial formality, was profoundly human. At its core, it was a life defined by constant attention, by a commitment to presence, by the discipline to act deliberately even when the world offered distraction, chaos, or temptation. Every day, every hour, every movement was a lesson. Even the most mundane tasks, polishing a sword, arranging a meal, cleaning a courtyard, were exercises in mastery. The body was trained, yes, but the mind was equally honed. Awareness, restraint, focus, and judgment were sharpened not by singular acts of heroism, but by repetition, by reflection, by living deliberately in the ordinary moments that filled the spaces between battles. Consider the emotional landscape of a samurai. Honor was not a theoretical ideal. It was a living, breathing presence, shaping decisions, relationships, and identity. Loyalty was not simply obedience. It was the acceptance that one's life was intertwined with the fates of others, lord, family, comrades, and that failure and duty reverberated far beyond oneself. Pride was tempered by humility, because even the strongest warrior could fall, and every misstep had consequences. Yet vulnerability was not always embraced. Samurai were trained to endure, to conceal fear, to suppress weakness, to maintain composure. In that suppression, there was both strength and cost. Lives lived with intensity, yes, but also with quiet loneliness, with a constant weight of expectation pressing on the heart. During long periods of peace, this tension became particularly pronounced. A samurai raised for combat, for rapid decision-making under life or death circumstances, found himself navigating a world where patience and subtlety were the primary tools. The battlefield had moved into politics, social hierarchy, and moral dilemmas. To maintain honor without the external clarity of war required extraordinary self-discipline. Some flourished, applying their skills to administration, mentorship, and scholarship. Others floundered, restless, nostalgic for the clarity that decisive action once provided. The sword, though physically at rest, continued to symbolize vigilance, responsibility, and identity. Even in solitude, the samurai was never truly alone. Memory and history accompanied him, binding him to centuries of lineage, culture, and tradition. Every step carried the weight of ancestors' decisions. Every act echoed with the lessons of forebears. Every choice was shadowed by what had come before. This was both grounding and burdensome. The presence of history demanded reflection. How should one act? How should one live? How can honor be maintained when the world shifts beneath your feet? These were daily, intimate challenges, not resolved in single moments, but negotiated slowly, deliberately, and persistently. The arrival of the modern era tested this mental and emotional framework like nothing before. Western armies, diplomacy, firearms, industrialization, and social reform rendered centuries of traditional practice partially obsolete. Samurai swords, once instruments of survival and status, became ceremonial artifacts. Social hierarchies that had defined behavior and purpose collapsed. Samurai were asked to adapt, to redefine identity, to find new paths in a world that no longer recognized their traditional role. Some embraced this transformation, channeling discipline and focus into military, governmental, or business careers. Others resisted, clinging to the past through rebellion or quiet refusal to conform. These adaptations and resistances reveal the central tension of samurai life. Identity is not given. It is cultivated, and survival sometimes demands redefinition rather than replication of past glories. Yet the ethos of the samurai persisted. The principles that had guided them, self-discipline, courage, loyalty, awareness, patience, moral clarity, transferred into the fabric of society. Schools, armies, corporations, and governance adopted these traits implicitly. What had once been survival tools on the battlefield became guiding frameworks in civilian life. The persistence of these qualities demonstrates that mastery is portable, that character, once cultivated, continues to shape actions and outcomes, even when the original context disappears. Philosophically, the samurai embraced impermanence. Life, power, fortune, and health were temporary. Death was inevitable. The world was unpredictable. To cultivate serenity, focus, and ethical clarity in this environment was the highest expression of the warrior ethos. This acceptance did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it cultivated presence, decisiveness, and moral courage. The samurai understood that action divorced from awareness or principle is meaningless. Strength without purpose is destructive. Honor without reflection is hollow. Their legacy is not a list of victories, but a map of how to engage life with awareness, resilience, and deliberate choice. Emotionally, this practice was demanding. Samurai had to reconcile human desires, fear, attachment, anger, longing, with expectations of discipline, courage, and ethical conduct. They endured hardship quietly, often alone, and measured themselves against ideals that were exacting, sometimes impossibly so. Their triumphs were not always visible. The maintenance of composure, the execution of duty despite personal cost, the patience cultivated over years of daily practice. These are the victories of the soul, the triumphs that history rarely records but that defined their lives. Culturally, the samurai became both archetype and mirror. Within Japan, their presence influenced social norms, artistic expression, ethical philosophy, and education. Globally, the image of the disciplined, principled warrior captured imaginations. It became a symbol of resilience, mastery, and moral courage. Yet the fascination often emphasizes spectacle over subtlety. The true power of the samurai lies not in duels or rebellion, but in the cultivation of self amidst uncertainty, in the slow, persistent shaping of character, and in the quiet endurance of principles through time. The samurai story, therefore, is more than history. It is philosophy. It is psychology. It is a meditation on human resilience. It teaches that life is a battlefield, not always of swords and cannons, but of awareness, discipline, ethical choices, and responsibility. That endurance matters more than immediate victory. That character is forged over decades, in quiet repetition, reflection, and mindful action. That identity is cultivated, not inherited. That the truest measure of a person is how they act when the world is uncertain, when recognition is absent, when challenges are constant and unforgiving. Even now, the samurai continue to walk beside us, not as visible warriors, but as principles embedded in behavior, culture, and philosophy. The lessons of presence, patience, courage, and moral clarity resonate in every disciplined craft, every ethical decision, every act of perseverance under pressure. Their swords may rest behind glass, their banners may have fallen, their castles may echo with silence, yet the rhythm of their lives, the careful attention, deliberate movement, and conscious engagement with the world, continues to guide, inspire, and challenge those willing to observe. Even in the quietest moments, the samurai's life was never truly quiet. Silence itself was alive, a teacher, a test, a reflection of the world's impermanence. In the dim glow of dawn, a samurai might walk slowly through the castle gardens, feeling the dew on the moss, listening to the subtle whisper of wind through pine needles, aware of each sound, each shadow, each breath. There is a constant practice here, not of fighting, but of observing, of understanding, of positioning oneself mentally, physically, and spiritually in harmony with the world. Even the softest sound or smallest movement could reveal hidden truth, the intention of another, the shifting of weather, the subtle rhythm of life itself. Training was unending. It extended far beyond the battlefield. Kata, meditation, archery, fencing, calligraphy, strategy, philosophy, all were intertwined. Every practice, every repetition was a negotiation with imperfection. No movement was ever perfect, no decision ever fully absolute. A samurai honed himself over decades, not for recognition, not for applause, not for fleeting glory, but to cultivate mastery over himself. Discipline became identity. Mastery became habit. Awareness became survival, even in the absence of immediate danger. Emotion, for a samurai, was a landscape to navigate carefully. Fear, anger, grief, and desire were not suppressed entirely. They were observed, understood, and channeled. Anger, if left unchecked, could destroy a household. Fear, if ignored, could imperil a village. Grief was an opportunity to reflect on impermanence, desire, a lesson in restraint. Each emotion was a tool, a teacher, a test of how deeply one understood the human condition. The samurai walked this landscape daily, not because it was easy, but because true mastery demanded both the blade and the mind, the strength of body and the acuity of spirit. Peace was both a blessing and a burden. During long eras of calm, such as the Tokugawa period, samurai faced the challenge of maintaining purpose without a battlefield. The clarity of combat, the decisiveness, the immediacy of life and death was replaced by the subtle tests of administration, social diplomacy, teaching, and household management. The sword remained, but it became symbolic, ceremonial, a reminder of heritage rather than a tool of survival. Those who adapted thrived in this environment, applying the same rigor to intellectual pursuits, cultural refinement, and civic responsibility. Those who could not reconcile themselves to peace often found themselves restless, frustrated, or even tragic, yearning for the clarity of decisive action that was no longer required. The philosophical depth of the samurai was inseparable from these realities. They studied Zen, Confucian ethics, poetry, and history, not as abstract pursuits, but as methods of cultivating clarity, composure, and moral courage. They understood impermanence at a profound level. Life, power, and circumstance were all fleeting. Death was inevitable. By internalizing these truths, a samurai could act decisively, maintain calm under pressure, and uphold principle even when convenience, fear, or desire suggested otherwise. This dual cultivation of action and contemplation was what distinguished them from mere warriors. It was what allowed the ethos of the samurai to endure even when swords fell silent. The arrival of modernity tested every facet of this identity. Western armies, firearms, diplomacy, and industrialization disrupted centuries of social order. Samurai authority, once unquestioned, was challenged. Many faced exile from power, social relevance, or the need to reinvent themselves entirely. Some resisted violently, as in the Satsuma Rebellion. Others adapted, carrying discipline and focus into government, business, or cultural preservation. Both paths reveal the same underlying principle. The samurai's resilience was not in the sword, but in the mind. Mastery was not defined by conquest, but by the ability to act with integrity and awareness despite shifting circumstances. This resilience is the true legacy of the samurai. Their ethos, discipline, moral clarity, loyalty, patience, observation, endurance, remains relevant across centuries and cultures. It is visible in modern Japan's attention to craft, precision, and etiquette. It is visible in leadership, education, and civic responsibility. It is visible in the quiet cultivation of skill, the deliberate execution of work, and the maintenance of principle in the face of ambiguity. Globally, the figure of the samurai resonates because it embodies a human aspiration to live deliberately, to cultivate resilience, to act with purpose, and to uphold integrity even when circumstances are uncertain. Even beyond external influence, the internal life of a samurai offers lessons for anyone seeking mastery over self. The awareness that life is fleeting, that consequence is inevitable, and that every choice carries weight teaches a kind of humility. The insistence on deliberate action cultivates patience and presence. The integration of mind, body, and spirit develops harmony and resilience. And the quiet acceptance of mortality infuses each action with meaning, transforming mundane routine into profound practice. In many ways, the samurai story is not about swords, battles, or castles. It is about life itself. It is about confronting uncertainty with steadiness. It is about cultivating virtue when it offers no immediate reward. It is about persisting when recognition is absent and when the stakes are invisible. It is about carrying responsibility not as a burden, but as a framework for living. The samurai teach that mastery is a lifelong pursuit and that the most meaningful victories are often invisible, measured not by conquest, but by persistence, integrity, and awareness. Even centuries later, one can sense their presence in the rhythm of deliberate living, in a craftsman's careful attention to his work, in a teacher's patient guidance, in a leader's measured decisions, in the steady cultivation of self. The world may have moved beyond the battlefield, but the principles forged in that crucible endure. They endure in habit, in mindset, in culture, and in memory. They endure in the quiet, deliberate way we carry ourselves when no one is watching. And so, the samurai are never truly gone. Their swords may rest, their banners may fall, their castles may stand empty, yet the echo of their discipline, their moral rigor, and their awareness continues to ripple through time. Their lives invite reflection. How do we act when the world tests us? How do we maintain clarity, composure, and honor when circumstances shift beyond our control? How do we cultivate resilience and presence in a life that is fleeting, unpredictable, and often unforgiving? The story of the samurai continues not in battle, but in the measured choices, deliberate actions, and enduring principles that shape human lives. It is a story of persistence, observation, moral courage, and the subtle cultivation of mastery over self. And in contemplating it, we begin to understand that the truest essence of the warrior is not in victory or conquest, but in the continuous, disciplined, and conscious engagement with life itself. The samurai's life, in its essence, was a dialogue with time itself. Every day, every season, every moment carried both the weight of the present and the echoes of generations past. To be a samurai was to inhabit a world where history was not distant, but immediate, threaded through every gesture, every decision, every breath. The armor, the sword, the formalities, they were not mere tools or symbols. They were reminders of continuity, of responsibility, of the unbroken line of practice and principle that stretched backward into centuries and forward into the future. In this sense, the samurai were not just warriors. They were custodians of time, translators of memory into action, living bridges between past and present. Their mornings were deliberate, ritualized, almost ceremonial. Before the sun fully rose, a samurai might sit quietly on tatami, polishing a blade, preparing for the day, reflecting on the lessons of yesterday and the possibilities of tomorrow. Each movement was intentional, each breath measured. Even tasks that seemed trivial, arranging armor, cleaning the household, tending to a garden, were exercises in focus and presence. These actions were not symbolic in a superficial sense. They were training for life, exercises in attention, resilience, and ethical clarity. The external order mirrored the internal order. A mind disciplined in observation, a heart tempered in patience, a will cultivated for decisive action. Emotion, though carefully managed, was deeply present. The samurai understood that fear, anger, grief, and desire were not enemies. They were signals, teachers, guides. Anger, if harnessed, could sharpen resolve. Grief could deepen awareness of impermanence. Fear could clarify priorities. Desire could illuminate values. But unchecked, these emotions could destroy discipline, tarnish honor, and unravel the intricate network of relationships upon which society depended. Learning to navigate the terrain of the heart, to measure response against principle, to act with restraint and insight, this was as essential to survival as mastery of the sword. During times of prolonged peace, the tension between readiness and calm became especially pronounced. Generations of warriors trained for battle now faced a world where swords were rarely drawn, yet the mind was still expected to be vigilant. Some redirected their discipline into governance, education, and scholarship, applying the principles of strategy, observation, and moral judgment to the management of households, villages, and domains. Others struggled, longing for the clarity of immediate crisis, for the tangible proof of courage and skill that only combat could provide. Peace, in its quiet, required a different kind of bravery. Patience, self-control, and ethical steadfastness. The samurai's philosophical life was intertwined with these realities. They studied Zen, Confucian ethics, poetry, and history, not as abstract pursuits, but as practical tools for cultivating discernment, presence, and moral integrity. Impermanence, central to their worldview, was internalized. Life, fortune, power, and health were fleeting. Death was inevitable. The world was unpredictable. To act ethically, decisively, and calmly within these constraints was the highest expression of their discipline. Their philosophy did not remove difficulty. It illuminated the path through it, showing that composure, awareness, and moral courage could coexist with the chaotic uncertainty of existence. Modernity tested these principles like no battlefield ever had. Western technology, firearms, bureaucracy, and social reform disrupted the centuries-old order. Samurai status, privileges, and roles were challenged, forcing many to redefine identity entirely. Some resisted, sometimes violently, as with the Satsuma Rebellion. Others adapted, carrying discipline, loyalty, and focus in a government, commerce, and cultural preservation. Both paths demonstrate a central truth. The essence of a samurai is not the sword itself, but the cultivation of mind, body, and spirit. Mastery is portable, principle endures. Emotionally, this transition was profound. Samurai were asked to relinquish visible markers of identity, the blade, the title, the privileges that had defined them. Yet the internal discipline remained. Pride, once tied to martial prowess and hierarchical authority, now demanded recalibration. The challenge became existential. How to live with purpose when the world no longer defined your value. How to maintain honor when recognition fades. How to act with integrity when the rules of society shift. These questions reveal the deepest dimension of the samurai experience. It was as much a psychological and moral practice as it was physical. The enduring legacy of the samurai is found in the invisible structures of behavior, mindset, and culture. Attention to detail, calm composure under pressure, strategic thinking, moral reflection, and patient perseverance. These are traits that continue to resonate, shaping societies, guiding individuals, and inspiring art, literature, and leadership. Even beyond Japan, the figure of the disciplined, principled warrior appeals universally because it embodies qualities humans aspire to: self-mastery, resilience, ethical courage, and awareness of the fleeting, fragile nature of existence. At its core, the samurai story is a meditation on the human condition. Life, like a battlefield, is unpredictable and often unforgiving. Success, recognition, and safety are never guaranteed. Yet the cultivation of self, through discipline, reflection, awareness, and ethical engagement, provides a form of stability, a foundation that no external change can entirely erode. The samurai understood this deeply, living daily in a rhythm of preparation, observation, and intentional action. Their victories were often invisible, their triumphs internal. Yet these were the acts that defined their lives and shaped their legacy. Even now, centuries later, the samurai continue to teach. Their lives show that mastery is a continuous practice, not a finite achievement. That courage is not always found in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices made under pressure. That honor is not a reward, but a commitment sustained over time. That life's battles are as much internal as external, as much about perception, judgment, and moral clarity as about physical strength. They invite reflection on how we live, act, and carry ourselves amid the uncertainty of existence. The samurai are gone, and yet they endure. Their swords rest, their banners lie folded, their castles echo with emptiness. But the rhythm of their discipline, the depth of their awareness, the rigor of their moral practice, and the quiet cultivation of presence continue to ripple through time. In every deliberate action, every measured choice, every exercise in patience and attention, one can hear the echoes of their ethos. In this way, the story of the samurai is not a chapter of history to be closed, but a living dialogue, a mirror reflecting how we navigate life, face uncertainty, and cultivate character in the midst of impermanence. Even as the samurai moved through daily life, the shadow of the battlefield was never far away. Battles were not simply chaotic clashes of steel and blood. They were the culmination of years, sometimes decades, of preparation, training, and reflection. Every measured breath in a quiet garden, every repetition of a form, every meditation on life and death was part of a long apprenticeship for moments when chaos demanded clarity. The samurai understood that combat was as much mental and moral as it was physical. To strike without discipline, to charge without awareness, to fight without understanding the weight of consequence. These were mistakes that could not be undone. In the mornings before battle, a samurai's mind was a place of deliberate calculation. The landscape itself became a canvas for strategy. The slope of a hill, the curve of a river, the placement of rocks and trees, the alignment of the sun, all could be leveraged or become danger. Awareness of self, comrades, and enemy was paramount. Training had taught that even the smallest detail could shift the outcome. A misstep in footing, a hesitation in grip, a faltering of focus. The discipline of daily life, polished blades, precise movement, quiet observation, patient reflection, was the unseen foundation of every decisive moment in combat. Before swords were drawn, samurai would observe. They watched the enemy carefully, noting patterns, tendencies, and weaknesses. They understood that fear, chaos, and anger could cloud judgment, and they trained themselves to act with calm decisiveness, even as the world seemed to erupt into disorder. Every heartbeat, every twitch, every shift of weight was meaningful. The same patience used to arrange a tea ceremony, polish armor, or maintain a household was applied in anticipation of action. Combat was never impulsive. It was deliberate, measured, and informed by both skill and philosophy. The ritual of preparing for battle extended beyond the physical. Samurai often composed themselves, reciting poetry, reflecting on mortality, or silently observing the world around them. Death was not feared but recognized as inevitable. This awareness of impermanence sharpened focus, steadied the hand, and cleared the mind. To a samurai, courage was not absence of fear, it was mastery over it. The moments before a fight were a test of composure, the final rehearsal of decades of preparation. Even as they approached the battlefield, the samurai maintained discipline in posture, breath, and thought. The environment was a participant in the conflict. The rustle of leaves, the slope of the ground, the glint of sunlight on armor could all influence decisions. Samurai considered each movement carefully, weighing speed against precision, aggression against restraint. They knew that mistakes were fatal not just to themselves, but to comrades and those they were sworn to protect. Battle was a crucible, but it was also a continuation of a lifelong practice of observation, awareness, and disciplined action. And yet, combat was not purely technical. It carried a moral weight. The choice to strike, the decision to defend, the decision to kill or spare, all bore consequence. Honor dictated not only skill, but judgment. A reckless blow could bring shame as surely as defeat. Hesitation could imperil lives. The samurai understood that combat was a mirror of character. How one fought revealed the depth of discipline, the clarity of mind, and the steadiness of heart. Victory was measured not only by survival or conquest, but by adherence to principle under the extreme pressures of life and death. The first clashes were often overwhelming. Arrows streaking through the air, the shock of metal meeting metal, the screams of men and horses. Yet even here, the trained samurai remained aware. Panic was the enemy. Discipline was the shield. Observation guided action. Each strike, parry, and movement flowed from years of repetitive training, internalized strategies, and a profound understanding of self and environment. Even in chaos, there was order, and the order of preparation often decided the outcome before the first sword fully met its mark. Even as battles escalated into full conflict, strategy and awareness dominated. Samurai rarely charged blindly. They moved with calculated coordination, exploiting terrain, timing, and psychological pressure. They knew that courage alone was not enough. Victory demanded skill, patience, and understanding. The clash of armies was not a spectacle of impulsive violence. It was a dance of precision, a mental and physical chess game where each movement carried the weight of life and death. And yet, the human element could never be eliminated. Even the most disciplined samurai felt the surge of adrenaline, the pull of fear, the intensity of focus, and the burden of responsibility. These emotions, tempered through years of preparation, became tools rather than hindrances. The samurai could channel them into clarity, speed, and effectiveness, turning instinct into strategy and fear into vigilance. Combat was not the absence of thought. It was thought in motion, a continuous negotiation between mind, body, and circumstance as the sun rose higher. The battlefield revealed itself in full detail. Samurai moved deliberately, scanning the terrain, feeling every nuance beneath their feet, observing the subtle shift of light and shadow across the landscape. Each movement, each breath, each heartbeat was a rehearsal of decades of training. The clash of armies was not merely a contest of strength. It was a test of awareness, patience, and ethical resolve. Every step forward was measured, every strike calculated, every moment infused with the lessons of preparation. Before the first contact, samurai assessed the enemy. Their eyes recorded patterns, how the soldiers shifted in formation, the spacing of the archers, the cadence of the drums that set the rhythm of the opposing forces. Even the slightest hesitation or overconfidence could be fatal. A samurai had to read both the physical and psychological currents of the battle, predicting intent, anticipating movement, and understanding the vulnerabilities of both enemy and environment. They had trained for this moment in countless hours of repetition, in empty fields, in gardens, in the silent discipline of everyday life. Now, that training was alive, flowing through muscle memory and mental acuity. The first arrows flew, cutting through the air with a sharp whistle. Horses shied, men shouted, and the world erupted into chaos. Yet the samurai remained centered. Their stance was deliberate, their grip precise. Every motion was an extension of years of conditioning. As they moved through the hail of arrows, they maintained awareness of friend and foe, terrain and wind, opportunity and danger. Combat was not reckless or impulsive. It was a continuous negotiation of action and reaction, a fluid dance of observation, timing, and intent. When the first swords met, the sound was shocking, yet methodical beneath the surface. Steel rang against steel, but each strike was grounded in discipline, each block a rehearsal of countless repetitions. Samurai moved with a combination of speed, control, and calculation. They struck where defense was weakest, exploited openings without overextending, and adjusted constantly to shifting circumstances. Battle was a chess game in motion. Every step mattered. Every miscalculation could be fatal, and yet the rhythm of engagement flowed like a natural extension of training. Even in the thick of combat, the samurai maintained ethical awareness. They knew the difference between necessity and cruelty, between duty and vengeance. Honor dictated not only skill, but judgment. To fight recklessly, to kill indiscriminately, or to abandon comrades was dishonorable. Every decision carried consequence. Survival alone was not enough. The preservation of self-respect, the upholding of duty, and the alignment with principle were equally critical. In this way, the samurai transformed combat into a reflection of character, where mastery of self was inseparable from mastery of battle. Strategy extended beyond the individual. Units moved with coordination, communicating silently through gestures, positioning, and rhythm. Commanders anticipated the flow of engagement, redirecting forces, exploiting terrain, and maintaining cohesion amidst the chaos. Each maneuver was grounded in the same philosophy that guided personal conduct: observation, patience, timing, and deliberate action. The battlefield was a living system, and the samurai were trained to interact with it intelligently, ethically, and decisively. Fear and adrenaline surged, yet they were tools rather than obstacles. The samurai had learned to observe these emotions, to channel them into focus, speed, and heightened perception. Every shout, every clash, Every movement could be leveraged. Panic was deadly. Calm decisiveness was life-saving. Through rigorous mental and physical preparation, the samurai transformed instinct into strategy, chaos into opportunity, and human limitation into a disciplined extension of their training. As the battle unfolded, moments of personal confrontation emerged. Individual duels between samurai were intense microcosms of the larger conflict. Every feint, every parry, every step forward tested not only skill but composure and ethical clarity. Victory was measured not by brutality alone, but by discipline, honor, and effectiveness under pressure. To strike hastily, to falter in judgment, or to allow fear to dominate meant more than personal failure. It risked the lives of comrades and the integrity of mission. Every duel was a synthesis of centuries of training, philosophy, and observation, distilled into a single, flowing confrontation. Even as victories were claimed and losses mourned, the samurai maintained awareness. Death was constant, yet sharpened rather than paralyzed. Each fallen comrade was a reminder of impermanence, of the weight of choice, and of the consequences that extend beyond the individual. Battle was a mirror of life itself, fleeting, unpredictable, and demanding of constant vigilance. The lessons of observation, patience, and ethical action that have been cultivated in quiet moments now determine survival and legacy on the battlefield. And so, the samurai moved, struck, defended, and survived, not through raw strength alone, but through mastery of mind, body, and spirit. Each engagement, whether a small skirmish or a massive clash of armies, was an expression of preparation, philosophy, and discipline. The external chaos was met with internal order. The unpredictability of circumstance was met with clarity of action. Combat, in its truest form, was an art, a test, and a reflection of a life lived deliberately, consciously, and ethically. As the clash intensified, the battlefield became a theater of both precision and chaos. Samurai advanced with deliberate timing, aware that hesitation could mean death and rashness could bring dishonor. The sound of steel striking steel rang out across the field, but it was not random noise. It was rhythm, a cadence of training, focus, and intention. Each strike had purpose. Each movement was a calculated response to the movements of others, to the subtle shifts in terrain, to the pressure of the moment. To the untrained eye, it may have seemed like sheer chaos, but the samurai moved within an invisible architecture of strategy and awareness. Every action tied to both immediate survival and long-term consequence. Arrows darkened the sky, slicing through the air with deadly precision. Samurai shields, armor, and positioning became crucial. Yet even here, judgment mattered as much as skill. A misjudged step or a misread motion could turn the tide in an instant. Leaders on both sides observed keenly, calculating distance, morale, and rhythm, adjusting formations, issuing orders with gestures or brief signals. Each unit, from infantry to mounted warriors, functioned as a living mechanism, coordinated through strategy, discipline, and shared understanding of timing. The battlefield was both physical and mental, a complex network where observation, reaction, and prediction determined life or death. Among the masses, smaller engagements emerged, duels that demanded a different kind of mastery. A samurai faced an opponent in close quarters. Every breath mattered. Every twitch of muscle, every flicker of intention could signal advantage or vulnerability. Combat here was not merely about strength. It was about reading the mind, anticipating the action, and responding with both speed and precision. Feints were as important as strikes. Parrying required balance, patience, and an awareness of momentum. Even in the most ferocious moments, the samurai maintained a clarity of mind, a calm that allowed instinct to operate within the bounds of training and principle. Strategy was inseparable from ethics. Samurai were taught that victory without honor was hollow, and survival without principle was meaningless. They knew when to strike, when to defend, and sometimes when to yield. Restraint was as vital as aggression, as lethal as any sword. To act impulsively was to invite catastrophe, to endanger oneself and comrades, to betray the very values that defined the warrior. Thus, each decision in combat carried weight beyond the moment, linking immediate action to long-term moral and practical consequence. Mounted samurai added another layer to the dance of battle. Horses became extensions of the warrior's body, requiring not only mastery of movement, but deep attunement to the animal's responses. Mounted strikes could disrupt formations, break morale, or create openings for infantry. Yet each maneuver required synchronization between rider and mount, thought and action, intention and execution. Even in the heat of battle, the samurai maintained composure, balancing speed and power with awareness of risk, terrain, and the unfolding pattern of conflict. Amid these maneuvers, communication was subtle but essential. Gestures, signals, and even the rhythm of movement allowed commanders to direct units without exposing themselves to danger. Awareness extended beyond the immediate fight. It encompassed the battlefield as a living entity, where every action influenced every other. The samurai's training and observation, patience, and anticipation allowed them to operate effectively within this network, turning chaos into coordinated action. But combat was never purely mechanical. It was infused with psychological intensity. Fear surged, adrenaline coursed, and the weight of responsibility pressed on every shoulder. Samurai had trained to transform these forces into heightened perception, focused energy, and precise action. A moment of hesitation could be fatal, yet panic was never an option. Awareness, discipline, and composure became tools as essential as the sword. Every movement reflected years of preparation. Every decision carried moral weight, and every action was a reflection of character. When duels reached their climax, the subtlety of movement became poetry in motion. Parry, strike, feint, counter, each sequence flowed with intention. Each pause held significance. The samurai's mind remained calm, constantly analyzing, predicting, and adjusting. Victory was rarely chaotic or indiscriminate. It was earned through skill, patience, and alignment of body, mind, and principle. And yet, even in triumph, the samurai carried awareness of consequence, of life and death, of honor maintained or lost. Every battle was both external and internal. A confrontation with the enemy, yes, but also with fear, pride, and the ultimate impermanence of life itself. Even after the clash subsided, the lessons of combat remained. Observation, patience, adaptability, and ethical clarity. These were tested in the heat of battle and refined in its aftermath. The samurai's mind and body, tempered by experience, carried forward, influencing daily life, governance, and culture. War was not merely destruction. It was the final stage of centuries of preparation, a crucible in which the principles of discipline, strategy, and moral courage were enacted and measured. As the day of battle unfolded, the scale of engagement revealed itself in waves of motion, chaos, and calculated intent. Infantry lines surged forward, horses thundered across open ground, and archers loosed volleys that darkened the air. Yet beneath this apparent disorder was an intricate network of discipline and observation. Samurai moved with purpose, reading not only the enemy, but also the subtle cues of terrain, wind, and timing. Every hill, every stream, every tree became a potential advantage or hazard. To act without full awareness was to court disaster. Every movement, no matter how small, carried consequence. The first major clash of blades was an overwhelming storm of noise, motion, and energy. Steel rang against steel, cries of exertion filled the air, and the rhythm of combat became almost hypnotic. Samurai engaged with precision honed over decades. Each strike, parry, and feint was a conversation between minds and bodies, a continuous negotiation of intention and response. Even in the frenzy, awareness remained paramount. They observed the enemy's stance, anticipated the trajectory of a blade, and timed each movement to exploit openings without overextending. This was combat as both art and strategy, a dance of lethal precision framed by centuries of discipline. Amid the mass formations, individual duels broke out, microcosms of the larger conflict. A lone samurai faced a rival, each waiting for the slightest imbalance, each measuring distance, speed, and intent. The first strike was a test, probing defenses. Feint and counter, parry and thrust. The duel unfolded like a conversation, a battle of both body and mind. Victory required not just strength, but observation, patience, and calm. A misstep could mean death, but a decisive, measured action could end the engagement swiftly and honorably. Even in these moments, ethical clarity was essential. Recklessness or cruelty was dishonorable. Discipline, precision, and respect defined true mastery. Mounted warriors added another dimension. Samurai on horseback were both weapons and observers, moving fluidly across terrain to disrupt formations, protect allies, or exploit vulnerabilities. The rhythm of horse and rider, the alignment of thought and motion, the timing of strike and defense. Each was a symphony of coordination. Even as chaos erupted around them, samurai maintained focus, using their mounts as extensions of themselves, translating awareness into speed and effectiveness. Tactics extended beyond individual skill. Commanders orchestrated waves of engagement, directing units with subtle signals or brief commands. Archers and infantry moved in coordination, exploiting terrain, adjusting formations, and maintaining morale. The battlefield was a dynamic system, where awareness and anticipation determined survival. Samurai training and observation, patience, and strategic thinking allowed them to read the larger pattern, predicting enemy movements and reacting with both flexibility and decisiveness. The intensity of prolonged combat tested endurance, both physical and mental. Fatigue pressed on muscles, vision narrowed, and the heart pounded with the unrelenting stress of life and death. Yet samurai had prepared for this over a lifetime. Breath control, posture, and mental focus allowed them to persist, to make clear decisions even as the body screamed for rest. They understood that survival depended not on brute force alone, but on rhythm, balance, and the alignment of mind, body, and environment. Even as victories were won and losses suffered, the ethical dimension of battle remained central. Samurai measured success not solely by the enemy's defeat, but by adherence to principle, discipline, and honor. A blow struck in anger without purpose, a misjudgment that endangered allies, or a moment of cruelty could mar the warrior's reputation and tarnish the essence of their training. Combat was therefore a test not only of skill, but of character, a crucible in which morality, strategy, and mastery of self were inseparable. Small skirmishes intertwined with large-scale maneuvers, creating layers of strategy and consequence. Cavalry charges broke enemy lines, but required coordination to avoid overextension. Infantry formations pressed forward, holding ground, protecting archers, and exploiting openings. Each decision, when to advance, when to hold, when to retreat, carried weight. The battlefield was alive, responding to every action, and the samurai's awareness, preparation, and moral clarity guided them through its shifting currents. The human element added unpredictability. Fatigue, fear, pride, and courage flowed through every warrior. Samurai had trained to harness these forces, to channel fear into vigilance, adrenaline into focus, and pride into measured confidence. Panic was deadly. Composure was essential. Even in moments of intense danger, the disciplined mind allowed clarity, turning chaos into opportunity and ensuring that each movement, each choice, was purposeful and informed by principle. As the sun dipped lower, the battlefield bore the marks of prolonged struggle. Overturned wagons, fallen banners, wounded horses, and warriors both triumphant and defeated. Yet throughout the carnage, the samurai's presence was defined by precision, observation, and moral awareness. Each engagement, each duel, each charge and retreat reflected a lifetime of preparation, the integration of mind, body, and spirit. Battle was not merely survival or victory. It was the ultimate expression of discipline, strategy, and principle enacted under the harshest of conditions. As the days stretched on, the battlefield transformed into a living organism of motion, sound, and consequence. Campaigns were rarely decided in a single clash. Instead, they unfolded over hours, sometimes days, demanding endurance, strategy, and moral clarity. Samurai were tested not only in moments of immediate danger, but in the cumulative stress of sustained engagement. Fatigue weighed on the body, yet the mind remained alert, scanning, calculating, observing. Every movement, every decision, every strike carried both immediate and long-term consequence. The samurai understood that the tides of battle were fluid, and that a single misstep could unravel hours of careful planning. Commanders directed formations with subtle precision. Infantry advanced in measured waves. Cavalry maneuvered to exploit weak points, and archers coordinated volleys to disrupt enemy rhythms. Terrain became a weapon and a challenge. Narrow passes could funnel opponents into deadly traps. Rivers could delay reinforcements. Forests could conceal ambushes. The samurai read these patterns constantly, adjusting strategies, timing attacks, and calculating risks. The battlefield was not simply a site of violence. It was a dynamic system, a complex chessboard where observation, patience, and foresight determined success. Within these larger movements, countless personal duels unfolded. Samurai faced opponents one-on-one, testing skill, composure, and judgment under the harshest pressure. Each engagement was an extension of a lifetime of training. Footwork, grip, posture, breath, and focus all converged in decisive moments. A feint, a misstep, a moment of hesitation could mean death. A perfectly timed strike could turn the tide. Yet even in these moments, the samurai's ethical awareness remained. Victory without honor was hollow. Triumph without principle meaningless. Each duel became a microcosm of the larger campaign, a test of discipline, morality, and mastery. Mounted samurai played a pivotal role in extended engagements. Horses, trained and disciplined, became extensions of the warrior's body and mind. Cavalry charges could break enemy formations, create opportunities, or protect allies, but only if executed with precision and coordination. Miscalculation could lead to catastrophic losses. Riders had to maintain awareness not only of their surroundings, but also of their mount's movements and reactions. The integration of animal and human, strategy and reflex, anticipation and action became a living demonstration of samurai training in full effect. The psychological intensity of multi-day campaigns was immense. Samurai experienced fear, fatigue, grief, and adrenaline in waves, yet they had been trained to channel these forces into clarity, vigilance, and precise action. Panic could be fatal. Composure was essential. Even as comrades fell and chaos erupted, the disciplined mind enabled action rooted in awareness and principle. Survival was not simply a matter of skill. It was the product of focus, patience, observation, and the moral courage to act correctly under pressure. Nightfall brought temporary respite, but not relief. The battlefield transformed into a space of reflection and vigilance. Samurai tended to the wounded, maintained equipment, and prepared for renewed engagement. Even in rest, observation continued, listening for movement, monitoring morale, reflecting on previous actions. The lessons of each encounter were internalized immediately, informing the decisions of the next day. In this way, combat extended beyond physical engagement, becoming a continuous exercise in strategy, reflection, and character. Some battles spanned multiple engagements, with strategies evolving over hours or days. Ambushes were set, feints employed, retreats executed to draw enemies into traps, and supply lines protected or disrupted. Samurai coordinated across units, maintained morale, and anticipated enemy adaptation. Victory was rarely instantaneous. It emerged from consistent application of discipline, foresight, and adaptability. Every maneuver required ethical consideration. To sacrifice allies recklessly or strike without purpose was dishonorable and strategically unsound. The samurai measured both outcome and conduct, ensuring that every action aligned with principle. Within this chaos, moments of individual brilliance shone. A samurai could shift the outcome of a skirmish through a decisive strike, a clever maneuver, or keen observation of enemy weakness. Yet these moments were grounded in preparation, patience, and discipline, not chance or impulse. Each act reflected years of training, repeated patterns of thought and movement, and an awareness of both self and environment. Even in the throes of life and death struggle, the samurai's engagement was deliberate, measured, and principled. As campaigns drew on, the cumulative toll became evident. Fatigue, injury, and loss tested endurance. Yet the samurai's resilience, forged over a lifetime of training and reflection, allowed persistence. They understood that survival and honor required both adaptability and unwavering commitment to principle. Each day's battle was both a continuation of the campaign and a reflection of a lifetime of preparation. The integration of mind, body, and moral awareness enacted under relentless pressure. Even in victory, reflection was immediate. Samurai examined the outcomes of engagements, the decisions made, and the consequences wrought. Success was measured not merely in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in adherence to discipline, observation, and principle. Losses were examined with the same rigor, each mistake cataloged, each lesson internalized. The battlefield was both a site of conflict and a classroom, teaching vigilance, strategy, endurance, and the consequences of ethical action. As campaigns stretched across weeks, sometimes months, the samurai came to understand the battlefield as both physical terrain and a landscape of strategy, psychology, and endurance. The initial surge of combat, the charge, the clash, the first exchange of blades, was only the opening act. Beyond that, war became a test of persistence, adaptation, and insight. Supply lines had to be maintained, reinforcements anticipated, and the enemy's tactics constantly monitored. Each day demanded vigilance, and every decision could reverberate for miles, affecting not only the samurai themselves, but entire armies, villages, and the fragile threads of alliances that end these extended conflicts. The samurai's discipline became their greatest weapon. They maintained strict routines even amidst chaos, polishing swords, reinforcing armor, inspecting horses, rehearsing strategies, and reflecting quietly when possible. Fatigue was constant, hunger persistent, and danger never absent. Yet the mind trained for decades of meditation, repetition, and disciplined observation allowed clarity even when the body screamed for rest. Focus was maintained in fleeting moments, in sudden clashes, in rapid decisions where hesitation meant death. Skirmishes erupted unpredictably. A scouting party could stumble into ambush, a small outpost could be assaulted, and the samurai had to respond with both precision and decisiveness. In these moments, observation and intuition were inseparable. Every sound, every shadow, every ripple in the terrain was information. The seasoned warrior could sense an enemy's presence before they appeared, anticipate their movements, and position both self and allies advantageously. Victory was often less about brute force than about the application of disciplined awareness at the right moment. Personal duels remained central, even within the chaos of larger engagements. A samurai, facing a single opponent, had to integrate centuries of training with split-second decisions. Footwork, grip, timing, and rhythm all converged in a dance of life and death. Feints were deployed, openings exploited, and patience measured. Even the rush of adrenaline and fear was converted into focus. Each duel was both a technical challenge and a reflection of character, testing ethical clarity, composure, and the ability to act decisively without losing honor. Mounted samurai continued to shape the flow of campaigns. Cavalry charges could break enemy lines, cover retreats, or create openings for infantry. Yet these maneuvers required coordination, trust, and adaptability. Riders had to feel the movement of their horses, anticipate enemy responses, and remain aware of shifting terrain and momentum. Mounted engagements were a ballet of power and control, blending human skill, animal instinct, and strategic awareness. Even amidst chaos, the rider and horse moved as a single instrument of precision. Morale became a critical factor over extended campaigns. Samurai observed not only enemy movement, but also the emotional currents among their own forces. Fatigue, fear, and uncertainty could erode cohesion. Maintaining focus, discipline, and ethical leadership was essential. A samurai's presence on the battlefield was both protective and symbolic, demonstrating courage, calm, and adherence to principle even when exhaustion threatened to dominate. Leadership was enacted not only through orders, but through example. Over the days of conflict, the battlefield became a teacher. Each engagement, each skirmish, each duel was studied, internalized, and reflected upon. Mistakes were analyzed. Successes were cataloged. Tactical adaptations were refined. Strategies were recalibrated. Samurai viewed these experiences as both survival and education, opportunities to hone not only skill, but character. Each day was a rehearsal for the next, each clash a meditation on strategy, ethics, and endurance. Even amid triumphs, the presence of mortality was inescapable. The death of comrades, the sight of bloody terrain, and the constant threat of personal loss instilled both humility and vigilance. Fear was acknowledged but mastered. Anger was observed but restrained. Every action was measured, deliberate, and informed by principle. Victory, in this light, was not simply the outcome of battle, but the maintenance of discipline, composure, and honor under relentless pressure. The ebb and flow of campaigns revealed a profound truth. War was not merely combat. It was a crucible for character. Each decision, each strike, each maneuver tested the alignment of mind, body, and moral clarity. Survival required not only skill, but vigilance and reflection. Honor was earned in moments of discipline, composure, and ethical action, often when no one watched. And even as armies moved, fought, and fell, the samurai remained acutely aware of impermanence, both of life and of fortune, allowing focus, clarity, and courage to guide each step. In O account of the samurai, would be complete without the story of the tools that defined them, the katana and the armor. These were not mere instruments of war. They were extensions of the warrior's body, mind, and spirit, crafted with precision, patience, and profound artistry. Each piece carried centuries of knowledge, skill, and intention, reflecting both practical necessity and a philosophical worldview. To hold a katana or don a suit of armor was to enter a partnership with history itself, to embody the discipline, awareness, and honor of generations before. The katana was more than a weapon. It was the soul of the samurai made manifest. Its creation began long before the forge, with careful selection of steel and iron. Samurai swordsmiths were masters of metallurgy, combining layers of harder and softer metals to create a blade both resilient and flexible. This process, called folding, was repeated dozens of times, eliminating impurities and distributing carbon evenly. The blade's curve, balance, and weight were calculated meticulously, allowing the samurai to execute precise strikes, swift parries, and fluid movement. The creation of a katana was therefore a meditation in itself, a process of patience, repetition, and harmony between material and maker. The forging process was ritualized. The steel was heated, hammered, folded, and quenched in water or oil, producing the distinctive grain patterns known as hada. This process required not only technical skill, but intuition and rhythm. Timing, temperature, and motion all had to be in perfect alignment. A single mistake could ruin hours or days of effort. The swordsmith approached each blade as both craft and philosophy, knowing that the final weapon would carry the weight of life and death responsibility for the warrior who wielded it. The katana was, in this sense, alive. It had a personality, a rhythm, a resonance with the hand that guided it. Once forged, the katana was polished and finished, a labor that could take weeks. Polishing revealed the subtle grain of the steel, the sharpness of the edge, and the curve of the blade. Each surface was honed to a mirror finish, reflecting not only light, but the warrior's own discipline and clarity of mind. The handle, often wrapped in ray skin and silk cord, was shaped for perfect balance, allowing precise control in every strike. The guard, or tsuba, was both functional and artistic, protecting the hand while expressing cultural and personal symbolism. To wield a katana was to hold a living history in one's hands, a weapon of unparalleled precision, imbued with honor, discipline, and connection to generations past. Armor, like the katana, was simultaneously practical and symbolic. Samurai armor was crafted to protect, to intimidate, and to signify status. It evolved over centuries, becoming lighter, more flexible, and more protective. Constructed from lacquered plates of iron or leather, connected with silk cords, the armor allowed freedom of movement while offering defense against arrows, blades, and blunt strikes. Helmets, often adorned with elaborate crests or horns, conveyed rank, family lineage, and presence on the battlefield. Each component of armor was carefully designed, weighted, and balanced, allowing the samurai to move with agility while remaining shielded from harm. The process of making armor was a meticulous craft. Artisans combined metalworking, leatherworking, lacquering, and textile skills to produce each suit. Plates were cut, riveted, and bound. Cords threaded in intricate patterns. Lacquer applied to resist the elements. The result was both functional and aesthetic. A suit that could withstand the rigors of battle while reflecting the samurai's identity and status. Armor was more than protection. It was a declaration of purpose, a visual expression of discipline, courage, and allegiance. Together, katana and armor represented the unity of mind, body, and spirit. The blade extended the samurai's intent, precision, and awareness. The armor enabled movement, protection, and confidence. To train with a katana while wearing armor was to learn coordination, endurance, and balance. The two were inseparable, each enhancing the other, each reinforcing the samurai's philosophy that life, combat, and discipline were continuous, integrated, and inseparable from principle. Beyond functionality, katana and armor carried deep symbolic meaning. The katana was a reminder of impermanence and mortality. Its edge demanded respect, its weight required awareness, and its sharpness imposed accountability. Armor symbolized resilience, status, and discipline, a physical manifestation of preparation, observation, and readiness. Together, they reminded the samurai that life was fragile, choices mattered, and mastery required constant cultivation. Even after battles ended, the care of katana and armor remained a central practice. Blades were cleaned, oiled, and sharpened, armor repaired and polished. These routines were not mundane chores. They were acts of mindfulness, reinforcing connection between warrior, weapon, and the principles guiding both. Through this attention, the samurai remained grounded, disciplined, and ever ready, aware that life could demand action at any moment. In this way, the sword and armor became inseparable from the identity of the samurai. They were not tools alone, but reflections of skill, philosophy, and legacy. To wear armor and wield a katana was to embody centuries of training, moral clarity, and discipline. Each strike, each movement, each defensive maneuver was informed by the integration of mind, body, and material, a living dialogue between the warrior and the world. When the samurai entered battle, katana in hand and armor secured, every movement became an expression of their training, awareness, and discipline. The blade was not merely a weapon. It was a natural extension of the body, responding instantly to intention, observation, and reflex. Every swing, every parry, every thrust was precise, measured, and deliberate. Armor allowed freedom of movement while providing protection, each plate and cord calibrated to absorb strikes without impeding action. Together, they formed a system in which warrior, weapon, and armor were inseparable, operating as one organism of focus, skill, and ethical purpose. In the first moments of engagement, the katana demonstrated its unique design. Its curved blade allowed swift, fluid cuts, enabling strikes that followed the natural arc of the human body. Unlike heavier swords that demanded raw strength, the katana relied on timing, precision, and balance. A samurai could deflect multiple attacks in succession, flow from offense to defense seamlessly, and exploit openings in the enemy's formation with minimal wasted motion. The edge was razor sharp, honed to a near-perfect degree, capable of cutting through armor or bone when applied with correct technique and timing. Every strike carried not just physical force, but the weight of intention, preparation, and moral resolve. Armor, meticulously constructed and balanced, played an equally vital role. Plates of lacquered iron and leather absorbed blows, silk cords allowed flexibility, and carefully designed joints enabled rapid motion. A samurai could twist, dodge, or counterattack with agility even under heavy armor. Helmets, often adorned with symbolic crests, protected the head while reinforcing presence and status on the battlefield. Gauntlets, greaves, and chest plates were all engineered to combine protection with mobility, ensuring that each movement could be executed without compromise. Armor was not only defense, it was confidence, allowing the samurai to act decisively, knowing their body was shielded by generations of craft and knowledge. As formations collided, the katana's rhythm became a dance of precision. Parry, thrust, feint, strike, each action was both practical and philosophical. The samurai's mind moved in parallel with the body, observing enemy intent, anticipating movements, and adapting to shifting circumstances. Even amidst the chaos, composure remained central. Panic could destroy coordination, Haste could invite fatal mistakes. The integration of mind, body, and weapon was essential. A samurai who could maintain awareness, timing, and ethical clarity could turn the tide of a duel or even influence the flow of a larger engagement. Mounted samurai used a synergy of sword and armor to dominate open terrain. A horse provided height, speed, and momentum, amplifying the force of strikes while enabling rapid repositioning. Yet control over the mount required as much skill as the use of the blade itself. Balance, timing, and anticipation were critical. A misaligned strike or poorly timed maneuver could unseat the rider or compromise effectiveness. The armor allowed protection while riding, yet demanded awareness of weight and movement. Mounted engagements were therefore tests of coordination, strategy, and adaptability, demonstrating the samurai's mastery across multiple dimensions of combat. Even in smaller-scale duels, the katana and armor dictated approach. Footwork was guided by the blade's reach and curve. Defense was structured around the protective zones of the armor. A samurai studied both opponent and self, looking for openings, measuring distance, and controlling tempo. Each movement became an interplay of attack and defense, anticipation and reaction. In these duels, the artistry of the katana and the craftsmanship of armor were fully realized, reflecting both skill and principle. Victory depended not on strength alone, but on perception, timing, and ethical restraint. Beyond the individual, in larger engagements, the combined utility of sword and armor-shaped strategy. Infantry lines could hold under pressure, cavalry could break enemy formations, and archers could operate under the protective presence of armored samurai. Leadership and coordination became visible through the flow of disciplined movement, the alignment of weapon and body, and the presence of warriors who embodied centuries of training. Armor communicated stability, presence, and resilience. The katana communicated readiness, precision, and decisiveness. Together, they allowed the samurai to act as both shield and spear in complex engagements. Even as battles raged, the samurai's relationship with their equipment was deeply reflective. The katana demanded respect, mindfulness, and constant care. Armor demanded awareness, balance, and trust in both the material and the wearer's own body. To wield sword and wear armor was to maintain a constant dialogue between preparation and action, principle and necessity, mortality and skill. Combat was therefore as much a mental and ethical endeavor as it was physical. The samurai who understood this balance could act decisively, maintain composure under extreme pressure, and uphold honor even in moments of life and death. Each battle confirmed a profound truth. The katana and armor were not mere tools. They were extensions of identity, discipline, and philosophy. Every movement of the blade reflected intention. Every maneuver within armor reflected preparation. In the chaos of war, these artifacts transformed chaos into order, fear into focus, and mortality into mindful action. The samurai's life, training, and principle were inseparable from their equipment, each element reinforcing the other, creating a system in which survival, honor, and mastery converge. As the years of campaigns and conflicts passed, the battles that once defined the samurai became memories etched into mind, body, and spirit. The clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, the surge of adrenaline, all gradually gave way to reflection, to a quieter rhythm of life that demanded the same discipline and awareness as war, but without the immediacy of life and death. Even as the swords were sheathed and the armor stored, the lessons of combat persisted. They were lessons not only of skill, but of presence, patience, and the delicate balance between action and restraint. The samurai came to understand that the ultimate battle was not always on the field. It was the struggle to live with honor, to maintain clarity of mind, to uphold principle in moments when no one watched. The katana, once a blade of life and death, became a symbol of reflection, focus, and responsibility. Armor, once a shield against enemy strikes, became a reminder of resilience, preparation, and self-discipline. Life itself had become the battlefield, each choice a duel between desire and restraint, impulse and judgment, fear and courage. Many samurai turned their attention to teaching, governance, and cultural preservation. They passed down techniques, philosophies, and traditions to students, families, and communities, ensuring that the discipline, observation, and ethical clarity honed over lifetimes would endure beyond the fleeting span of a single life. Swordsmanship became not only a physical practice, but a medium for teaching patience, presence, and moral courage. Armor, katana, and ritualized training all became tools for cultivating awareness and character in the next generation. In this way, the spirit of the samurai extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping society, culture, and personal identity for centuries to come. Even as eras of peace prevailed, the samurai's internal landscape remained vivid. Meditation, study, and reflection took the place of combat, but the principles endured. Discipline, focus, observation, and ethical clarity guided daily life. Every task, no matter how small, was performed deliberately. Every decision weighed with awareness of consequence. The teachings of battle, timing, patience, adaptation, and composure were applied to governance, family, and personal cultivation. The external weapons had quieted, but the internal mastery remained alive. Mortality, once a constant companion on the battlefield, became a lens through which the samurai understood life itself. The impermanence of existence, the fragility of fortune, and the inevitability of death shaped a profound appreciation for each moment, each choice, and each interaction. The sword and armor had taught this lesson in a literal sense, but it extended to every aspect of living. Life, like combat, demanded presence, clarity, and integrity. To act without awareness, to make choices without reflection, was the truest form of vulnerability. The samurai understood that honor was maintained not only in victory, but in the way one lived and faced the ephemeral nature of existence. In later years, many samurai retired from service, their swords no longer drawn in anger, their armor no longer clanging in battle. Yet they remained guardians of principle, teachers of discipline, and exemplars of resilience. The rhythm of daily life, the tending of gardens, the polishing of swords, the instruction of students, became a living continuation of the same ethos that guided them in combat. Every act, no matter how mundane, was infused with the same intentionality, the same awareness, and the same adherence to principle. The essence of the warrior endured, even as the world around them changed. The katana, carefully cared for and revered, became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of connection to ancestors, to tradition, and to the ongoing practice of mastery. Armor, stored with care and respect, became a reminder of resilience and preparation. Together, they embodied the continuity of discipline and the integration of mind, body, and spirit. To live as a samurai, even in times of peace, was to carry these principles forward, to cultivate mastery, presence, and moral courage in every aspect of life. And so, the story of the samurai gradually quieted, leaving behind echoes rather than clamor. The clash of battlefields softened into memory. The heat of combat transformed into reflection. What remained was not the glory of conquest, nor the terror of war, but the enduring lessons of discipline, awareness, honor, and ethical courage. The samurai had faced life and death with clarity and composure, and in doing so, had left a legacy that transcended time, geography, and circumstance. Even now, centuries later, their influence can be felt in craft, leadership, art and the cultivation of character. The katana and armor may rest and display, the battle's long since concluded, but the ethos of the samurai endures, a call to live deliberately, to act with awareness, to maintain composure in the face of uncertainty, and to cultivate honor and resilience in all endeavors. Their story is a mirror, reflecting both the fragility and potential of human life, reminding us that true mastery is not measured by victory alone, but by the conscious, disciplined, and principled way one navigates existence itself. And in that quiet reflection, the samurai are not gone. They live in every measured breath, every deliberate action, every moment of presence and integrity. The swords are sheathed, the armor rests, the banners lie folded, but the spirit remains timeless, enduring, and profoundly alive.